Dr. Farrell, we have a new show today.
Yes.
Welcome our audience. I would like to dub this particular episode the Dr. Farrell Told You So episode. Because
Okay.
Dr. Farrell does not know what we're going to be talking about, ladies.
No, I don't, and I have misgivings already, but go ahead.
But in each of these categories, I think we'll hear, Dr. Farrell will have the right to go, and I told you so. There are 5 segments, and unlike other shows, I'm going to announce what the segments are at the beginning because I have given them some interesting names. And I want you to picture, what's that game show where you say, I'll take unmarried wives for 500, you know?
Jeopardy.
Jeopardy. I think today we should think of these like Jeopardy categories, except you're going to have to go through all of them. So segment number 1, or shall we call it round 1?
Yes.
High profile suicides for 500.
Oh, jeez.
Segment 2, unexploded World War II bombs for 1,000. Segment 3, another run at the Fermi paradox for 50,000. And this has really taken us into our bonus round. Segment 4, that Cuba thing and the Navy accidents both stink to high heaven for $1 million.
Yeah, they do. And
for the absolute $20 million round, it's going to be category or segment number 5 of our show. What would happen if we really did find out about the Federal Reserve gold? And so, I think we'll get into that more. Do we really want to know?
Do we really want to know?
What? Maybe it's better we just put that one back to bed. Better for everybody.
That's good. Do we really want to know? No, probably not.
Maybe not a good idea to keep asking.
Not a good idea.
Those of you that really want to know, just keep it amongst you.
Yeah, keep it quiet.
So, Dr. Farrell, I'm going to kick off segment number 1 with, which I've already titled, but I've also thought of an honorary personage for each segment of the show.
Oh,
and so this will be our honorary Franz Ferdinand segment, where we deal with high-profile suicides. I didn't pick anybody too controversial right now. You know.
Well, wait a minute. He wasn't a suicide.
I know. That's the point, Dr. Farrell. Ding, ding, ding. Give that man. All right, that's the $500. He got it, ladies. So, when you commit suicide with the other guy's saber, it's not a suicide. So, the quote I want to begin with, and we often begin with a quote. The quote I want to begin with comes from one of my favorite science fiction authors, which is Robert Heinlein. Mm-hmm. And this comes from my second favorite book by him, which is called Friday. Mm-hmm. Friday is, of course, a trained assassin. And this is the quote. Throughout history, the conventional way of dealing with an awkward witness has been to arrange for him to stop breathing. If you don't believe that such things can happen, we aren't living in the same world, and there's no point in you reading any more of this. And I think this will be one of those moments when that quote becomes applicable. So, Dr. Farrell, I want to ask you about some high-profile suicides. And the ones I'm kind of interested in the most are the ones that look normal. They look like they would happen. Like, Chester Bennington, lead singer of Linkin Park. All right, that little gimp was going to go sooner or later. Come on, So, and artists are moody, and they're it would seem normal for artists to just be a part of the largest running list of weird suicides ever. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, that brings us right to like Marilyn Monroe. We all, there's all kinds of theories and conspiracy theories around Marilyn Monroe. Right. Hunter S. Thompson is a high-profile suicide. Michael Jackson is a high-profile suicide, although that's a little weird. And there's then just a lot of, and there's, of course, all kinds of jazz musicians and other people. There's Butch Trucks, drummer of the Allman Brothers Band, Howard Ayler, the jazz saxophonist, James Robert Baker, the writer, Kurt Cobain, famously, obviously, guitarist for Nirvana, and so on. Robin Williams, more recently.
Yep.
And then you get into the sort of non-artist stuff, like you have Edwin Howard Armstrong, the inventor of the radio. which I find odd. If I invented electricity, the radio, or the wheel, or fire, I would probably not want to end my life, but there it is. And of course, there's Lady Di, and there's all kinds of thought about that. And don't forget Ernest Hemingway. So my first question about this is kind of twofold. So when you look at something like the honorary consul of Malaysia, Zahid Raza, which is not a suicide, it's an assassination, right? My question is sort of it's hard to articulate, but whenever we look at these high-profile suicides that there are conspiracy theories around, right? Whether it's Lady Di or Marilyn Monroe or some of the others, we assume that there was a need to hide the fact that it was an assassination. The moment you question whether indeed it was a suicide, or you label it suspicious, you have to say that somebody had a vested interest in making it not look like a suicide. And this differs dramatically from, say, the umbrella murderer, the guy, the Russian assassin that pokes a guy with an umbrella and sticks a drop of ricin in his body, or the polonium tea murder. Both of those clearly designed to, no confusion there, no suicide, no health, no accidental falling down and hurting yourself down the stairs, no accident, no suicide, clearly intentionally meant to be seen as an assassination. And then you go to something like the Malaysian consul handling all of this flight material. And my question is sort of twofold. So A, is there something to all of these high-profile media suicides that you think is suspicious? And if it's suspicious, why would there be a need to cover up the fact that they're assassinations? And then secondly, why make them look like suicides? And then secondly, with something like the Malaysian consul, why make it very clear that it's an assassination in the most egregious way? Stop his car, shoot his driver, shoot him. Why not make that a suspicious suicide? Or if you're going to assassinate the guy, do it in the subtle Russian way. So you see where I'm trying to get at? I don't understand the choice of methodologies here.
Well, look, I'm getting a little feedback.
Oh, I'll mute.
In the case of the Malaysian ambassador, to me that whole Flight 370 thing is it is still suspicious as heck. And I think someone's clearly trying to send messages there, although I would not have the foggiest clue as to who or why, other than that flight's disappearance, as far as I'm concerned, is still an unsolved mystery, and it's a big one. We have a member, I don't know if you know this, we have a couple of members actually in Australia that are pilots, and during the Flight 370 disappearance, particularly in the early stages when I was very suspicious about the whole thing, I still am, don't get me wrong, but when they were finding wreckage, this guy was sending me pictures of the wreckage and pointing out discrepancies. He knows parts of aircraft obviously better than I do, and he's pointing out some discrepancies between the aircraft that Flight 370 actually flew and what we were being shown as wreckage. And one of the things he clearly pointed out was it's been missing for long enough that there should be more signs of algae and things like that on it, and there weren't from the pictures I've seen and some of the pictures he sent. So clearly, my suspicion in the Malaysian ambassador's case, which is a clear assassination, is that the ambassador may have been privy to certain theories or information that they didn't want to get out. He clearly was in a unique position, as far as I can tell, to be able to look at all the debris and draw his own conclusions about what may have happened to the flight, or even if it was actual debris of the flight. We're having to take all of this on everybody's word that it is. And I'd be inclined to do that if a pilot from Australia hadn't sent me, several years back when they first started finding this debris, sending me his criticisms and his comments that it didn't look to him like all of this was really legit. So again, who would have been sending messages? I don't know. whoever brought the flight down, and I think that it was probably brought down by somebody, perhaps accidentally, perhaps using exotic technologies, which was my original theory. In the case of suicides, let's take Marilyn Monroe. I'm one of those that is very suspicious about her suicide. She was not the kind of flighty person that she's been portrayed to be in the popular imagination. Her household live-in maid or secretary, I forget what her name was, pointed out a number of anomalies right away, that Miss Monroe would never have done certain things that allegedly she did when she committed suicide. So why would you cover up somebody, an actual murder of somebody, by a suicide? And there, I think the motives are always fairly clear. You don't want to highlight certain features of a high-profile case by drawing attention to it as being a murder. So you make it look like an accident. In her case, it was very clear that she was having affairs with both of the Kennedy brothers, John and Robert. FBI Director Herbert Hoover had her under surveillance and so on and so forth. And there is, in some of the assassination literature, there are speculations that President Kennedy or his brother, one of the two, had confided in her some information, secret information, and that ranges everything from what's going on at Area 51 to UFOs to aliens. Take your pick. You would cover it up if you have a motive that you do not want to get out. So between these two things, in the Malaysian ambassador's case, you're clearly trying to send a message. Don't investigate this any further or you're going to die a horrible death. In Marilyn Monroe's case, you just kind of want to quietly shuffle the person off stage. She was an intelligent woman, and I think probably was able to piece things together on her own, and she may have been doing that. With Princess Di, you mentioned Princess Di. I don't recall that she was a suicide. She died in an accident, terrible auto accident in Paris. And she was, at the time, if I remember correctly, dating a very rich Muslim man, having an affair with him. And of course, that alone would be a bad thing as far as most of the members of the royal family are concerned. I'm not one of those that believes that the royal family murdered her. She was certainly causing them embarrassment and so on, but I doubt that they would go that far. So her death, there are suspicious things about her death and about that accident. And I do think it's possible that she may have been murdered. By who and for whatever reason, I don't know. But again, if you want to cover up something, you make it look like an accident or you make it look like a suicide if you do not want to send messages. To me, that's the key. If you assassinate somebody, there's usually some message involved. And it can even be as simple as, don't tangle with us, don't dare to tangle with us. We're capable of murdering a president out in the open in Dallas, Texas, and then parading a nonsensical explanation for it a year later. We've got that kind of power, don't tangle with us. So it's an interesting question. In the case of the Malaysian ambassador, the Malaysian ambassador in Madagascar, I have to be honest with you, Daniel. I'm suspicious as all get out, because to me the pattern there most resembles, believe it or not, in a certain sense, the suspicious death of General Patton after World War II. And I've always found that highly suspicious, and the reason why is for a reason very different than most people offer. And that is Patton, as the commander of the U.S. Third Army, which was the army tasked with invading southern Germany, Austria, and then parts of Bohemia and Czechoslovakia. My suspicion has always been, and I argued this way back in Reich of the Black Sun, that as the commander of the Third Army, he's receiving all the field intelligence reports of his advanced combat commands that are going into all these Nazi installations. And as a result, he's probably the one American officer in that period of time that has the best and complete and detailed picture of the extent of Nazi, pardon me, secret research. Well, the Malaysian ambassador strikes me as being in a very similar position. He's looking at all this debris. No doubt, being an ambassador, he's inventorying the debris, and he's also communicating with Kuala Lumpur what they're finding and what he's sending back, and so on and so forth. So he would have been in a very good position to know either what brought the flight down, assuming the debris is legitimate and genuine, or he would have been in a position to question whether or not the debris was actually debris from the flight or that it had been salted. The reason I mentioned salting is that I gave an interview with George Ann Hughes about a week to a week and a half after MH370 disappeared. And that's when I first advanced the crazy idea. Well, it just went poof. We don't know what happened to it. There may have been an exotic technology involved. I advanced that idea very early on. And interestingly enough, George Norrie and Richard Belzer, the American actor, wrote a book themselves called Something is Very Wrong Here. And Belzer and Norrie actually entertained the it just went poof hypothesis too, which kind of surprised me that people in their position would do that. So the Malaysian ambassador, I think we have a clear case of looking at messages being sent. Don't go any further into this. It's off the reservation.
Well, this is exactly why I bring it up. So, so the real rubric here of assassinations is you can have the overt kind where
Right.
Often meant to send a message, but at least no desire to hide and make it unclear.
Right.
Assassination. You can have the kind that is made to look like an accident or made to look like a suicide, where you're hiding. And it seems to me that those two categories reflect either one, you have a high-profile source of the assassination order that must be protected. So in the case of
Right.
if it was in the White House, in the case of Marilyn Monroe, you don't want anything to ever come back
Right.
to suggest that we need to investigate.
Right.
Investigation would lead down endless corridors you don't want pursued. But in the case of something like the assassinations ordered by Putin, you want to send a message. You want it very clear. Don't do
Right.
this. And to anybody else thinking about this, don't do this. And the Malaysian category, I was wondering if it fell into some third category, because it's not like the assassination of Robert Calvi, where he's found hanging with bricks in his pockets under a bridge.
Right.
It's covered with Masonic, symbols, etc. It's unclear. Not only it's clear that it's an assassination, but it doesn't fit the criteria of an assassination to make a statement.
Right.
In my view, because to make a statement. And I'm asking this because you're suggesting that it's to make a statement, but I would distinguish it between an assassination where it's clear who's doing the assassination and you just can't prove it, and it's don't do this, I don't want you to. There's two elements, the clear reason and the clear source.
Right.
In this case, there's only a clear potentially reason, but no clear source.
Right.
And that's what confuses me and makes me wonder if it doesn't belong into its own bucket. And why is it in that bucket?
Well, I take your point. Yeah, I think
you want to make a statement but not be able to trust the reliability of the statement because you don't know who's making it.
Yeah, I take your point, and I think it's well founded. If I were to speculate as to who's making the statement, I mean, very clearly, I think people are being warned off investigation of MH370, and the government of Malaysia, as far as I understand, has been trying to investigate this more or less on its own and has resisted, as far as I can tell. Now, there may be articles and facts out there I'm unaware of, but as far as what I'm aware of, and I've been kind of interested in Flight 370 since it happened. So whenever a story happens concerning it, I usually blog about it, or at least kind of file it in my Flight 370 folder. But in the case of the government of Malaysia, as far as I can tell, they have been rather reluctant to come to any agreed upon standard narrative. To their credit, I think. They were initially very reluctant. If you go back and remember how the story unfolded, there were lots of different versions of stories and some truly amazing nonsense put out on Fox News primarily, but some other networks in the United States about what happened. They were getting Pentagon generals talking about, well, the flight flew in the wake of another commercial aircraft over India. I heard that one on Fox News, and I thought, no, come on, And India, as soon as that came out, a day later, the Indian government said, no, that ain't going to happen. There's nothing entering our airspace that we won't know about, particularly in that fashion. So, the kookiness around it just got enormous. So who would be sending it? I don't know. Whoever had a stake in that flight, and there's so many conspiracy theories out there about it. The Rothschilds owned a computer chip company in Texas that had a bunch of people flying to China, and they didn't want the Chinese to get these computer chips, so the Rothschilds brought them down, But no one ever explained exactly how the Rothschilds did that, So there is a message, but there's no clear motive for it, other than my suspicion is, and I'm crawling way out again on the end of the twig here, my suspicion is one of the main reasons you would want to dissuade further investigation is if there was some sort of exotic means of bringing that aircraft down or assuming control of it, be it cyber hacking, taking over through the automated pilot system in the Boeing aircraft. Lufthansa, if that sounds like a crazy idea, Lufthansa Airlines in Germany, I think it was after 9/11, as a matter of fact, stripped out all of its Boeing automated pilot components. I heard a story. I don't know if it's true or not, but the story was out there that they did this after 9/11. So that raises the possibility, as many people have pointed out with Flight 370, that perhaps the aircraft was commandeered remotely through the autopilot system. Who knows? But whoever did this to the ambassador clearly, in my opinion, is connected with whatever brought down that flight, and for whatever reason, but we still don't know who. There's no good motive here for bringing that flight down, however it was done. So that's the problem.
Well, I wanted to ask about that. So I just have a couple more questions about this issue of high-profile suicides and assassinations and accidents. One is specifically the relationship of this Malaysian Air flight and this particular assassination to another assassination that took place in Malaysia. So you have North Korea assassinating Kim Jong-nam.
Right.
I mean, it is an odd timing. All the reporting around that assassination suggested that Kim Jong-un wanted to get rid of him for years.
Right.
And so why now, and why in Malaysia, where it's a lot harder to orchestrate in some ways?
Yes.
And I get that the guy is fleeing, but my point is that is a question. Do you think that there could be a relationship between Korean involvement in that assassination and Korean? Is there a potential relationship between that and this assassination of Zahid Raza?
There may be. I don't know. If there is a relationship, let's put it this way: if there is a relationship, then North Korea would have to be assumed to have had some hand in the downing of Flight 370, however it may have happened. But there the problem is that North Korea is not well known for its cyber hacking abilities.
Nor its infrastructure in general.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's the other problem. So if they did this by some exotic energy technology means, they would have had to have turned to their two big supporters, being Russia, which clearly has a track record of investigating and pursuing that type of technology in its black projects, and certainly the Russians are capable hackers. You know, that's been in the news nonstop for a year. The Chinese have their own projects in this respect as well. So, you know, but my problem there is I don't see where Russia or China, or for that matter, even North Korea, would have a clear reason to do this.
No, but I just to interject a moment, I'm noticing that most of the curiosity around that flight disappearance
Right.
into one of two categories.
Right.
What natural event could have caused it, and
Yes.
what high technology event could have caused it.
Right.
I saw something the other day. I saw a movie. Wasn't a very good movie. I don't recommend it. It's a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's one of those standard Middle Eastern plots. They're all the same: terrorist cell, bomb, you know, the whole thing. But in there, one of the things they said is we're dealing with a people who have come to realize that they're fighting men from the future. And what they realize is those men have cell phones, and they have the internet, they have all these other things. So what they've done to fight men from the future is revert back to an analog technology. They meet only in person, they pass notes by hand, and it's really hard for a bunch of digital warriors to detect.
Right.
And it strikes me that if North Korea, what I'm trying to get at is if North Korea had a hand in the flight disappearance, you're right that it couldn't be this super high technology thing. They don't have it.
Right.
But could it be that we're all looking at the wrong thing?
Sure.
Perhaps we're all being manipulated to look at for a high technology answer or a natural answer, when couldn't it be that the actual solution is so much more mundane, that somebody got co-opted, the North Koreans planted somebody, or there's some other element that simply diverted the flight, landed it in a prepared, obscure place at the right weather moment, and it's gone. And that's the reason why it's so easy to just steal a car and park it in a garage if you're not trying to sell it or do grand theft auto for some high profile reason, but you just grab a car, drive it around the corner, park it in your garage, close it, and go home.
Right.
And
well, it could be because North Korea, you mentioned the possibility of analog technology, and this, you're dead on here, especially in terms of some of the Russian exotic energy weaponry research, because a lot of that, to a certain extent, if you read very carefully in the literature, I'm thinking primarily of Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden's work, but there are some other researchers, the whole John Hutchison phenomena way back when. Most of those things were being tested with analog technology. So why analog? Well, for one thing, it's much more impervious to the usual electronic jamming sorts of technology. It's much easier to interfere with a digital system, particularly, as I speculated in my public blog about the Ambassador, particularly if you've got radio responsive computer chips that you've salted into certain things. It's much more difficult to do this with vacuum tubes, let's be honest. That's what we're talking about. You know, to this day, it's interesting that you mention analog for another reason, because to this day, if I'm not mistaken, Deutsche Welle radio still uses that big Nazi radio transmitter outside of Cologne, Germany, which is to this day running on vacuum tubes. They have refused to take it off the analog technology and roll it over to digital for whatever reason, and I'm assuming that it's probably a national security reason. So could North Korea, with kind of an outdated, outmoded analog technology infrastructure, do that? Well, sure. The problem here that I really have, Daniel, with MH370 is if you go back and you look at the way the story was unfolding, I think it was within a few days of the flight's disappearance, the Chinese government published satellite photos of something in the South China Sea off the coast of Vietnam. So the Chinese and the Vietnamese were sending out search parties to this area, and then they retracted that satellite photo, okay, and they didn't say any more about it. Now, I thought it at the time that this whole thing was highly unusual for several reasons. Number one, that the Chinese would reveal anything about their satellite capabilities. Number two, what they were doing, I suspect, was they were sending a message. We have a disappeared flight. It may have gone down. Everybody has got spy satellites that probably know where the actual, if it did indeed crash, this is the problem, where the actual debris field is. India has spy satellites, the Australians, the Japanese, the United States, the British, the Russians. That's an area of the world that's going to be rather thoroughly covered. So were the Chinese sending a message? You guys know where the debris field is, if there is one, or maybe they were trying to draw attention to the fact that there wasn't one. I don't know. I've moved across the entire spectrum with MH370. Initially, I thought it just went poof. None of the stories were making sense, so I thought, okay, let's do the Sherlock Holmes things and say that we have this hypothesis out there. After the debris was discovered, I thought, no, the poof theory is no longer probable, and I even blogged about that, and that's what prompted the Australian pilot to write to me and send me emails of parts photos and pointing out technical discrepancies in the debris, and a lot of it went over my head. But so I've moved back and forth on this all the time. To me, the ambassador's murder just put the whole thing back into high gear, because what it's telling me is that somebody's responsible for bringing that flight down. It's possible that it may have gone down through some sort of catastrophic accident that they don't want to talk about it, but I doubt it. To me, it's an indicator somebody brought it down, somebody knows how it was brought down, and that may be the big secret that they're trying to cover up.
Well, it is interesting that this particular model of airplane was not, and the Malaysian Airlines knew this, was not equipped with the kind of technology that's supposed to check in every 30 minutes, as most flights are,
right?
So continuously track it by satellite. It didn't have that.
Right. It did have the Rolls-Royce engines on it. It did have a pinging capability, and the Rolls-Royce company in Great Britain was getting pings from their engines. And if I remember correctly, some of those pings were coming in supposedly after the flight had, gone down. And after it had gone off of Malaysian and Chinese radar. But that, you're right, the actual systems itself, where the autopilot or the pilot's cabin checks in, this was something completely different. This was in the Rolls-Royce engines. So, there's all sorts of mysteries about this dang thing. And this just ratcheted up the whole problem as far as I'm concerned, because what it's telling me is the Malaysian ambassador in Madagascar knew something, and they were afraid he was going to talk, or he may have talked, and they're sending a message to the Malaysian government. And I think the Malaysian government probably has its suspicions too, which is the reason why it's very hesitant to adopt any narrative about it.
Well, I would guess that plane, if it landed intact, is now in a million pieces and melted down.
Yeah, probably.
Hard to say, but there's no reason to think they needed the plane.
Right.
Not seen any, I was waiting for people to come out with passenger manifests that either identified critical scientific expertise on board, or some other, person that has the potential to kidnap and extort for money, or something. But nothing's come out that I've seen that suggests that the passenger manifest is a cause.
Well, the only thing about the passenger manifest that has come out that I recall is there were a bunch of people from a Texas computer chip company that were flying to Beijing that were on that flight. And of course, that's sponsored all sorts of conspiracy theories. But again, we don't know exactly what their technology was. There were, again,
no reason to believe it was classified.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the problem I have with that whole conspiracy theory about that, and the Rothschilds buying the company, and all that business.
No, but it makes one wonder, I'm looking, so there's some saying, and I can't recall it, but it's like when it's the trick to understanding how a magic trick is done. When the entire crowd is looking one way, you look the
Yes,
other.
you look the other sleight of hand.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so that's what made me think of analog technology. And
There could be.
it also made me think about what if Malaysia itself it was involved in the disappearance. Nobody wants to ask that question any more than for the exact same reason that nobody wants to ask whether the U.S. government was involved in 9/11, because
Right.
The prospect of it is so offensive. Those people, that's a horrible thing to say. Everybody's brokenhearted about it. But that's exactly why one wants to ask the question, to do due diligence. And so maybe that's a long shot, but it made me wonder.
Well, it's not a long shot because, again, if you go back and cover the story when, there was about 2 or 3 weeks of speculation, and it reached the ridiculous and the depths that it reached on Fox News. But there were speculations that the pilot may have been suicidal. That's been disproven. There were all sorts of speculations, so I don't rule it out. The problem is we're given so little by way of data points that we can conjecture anything on this thing. All we know is that this aircraft has gone missing, and they're still coming out with the occasional story. Oh, we think the real debris field is here, or we think the real debris field is there. So yeah, I'm going to say
smacks of the sleight of hand thing. The more
yes.
You're kind of making that point earlier, that the more you keep distracting and showing possible debris fields, the more you're focusing the attention on the public and the news media in one area, which could be distracting from another. So it makes one wonder if we don't want to take a really close look at who's putting out those announcements, like China and like others that have said, we think it's here. Maybe that we is where the problem is.
It could be. This is a case where I told you so. Because when I did that interview with Georgianne, it was about a week and a half after the flight had gone missing. And we were just getting the beginning of the conspiracy theories. Oh, it flew to Diego Garcia. It flew in the wake of another aircraft over India to be landed in Iran or the Netherlands, depending on which version. And on this went. It reached ridiculous. It reached ridiculous levels. So on the Byte show, I told Georgianne, I said I would be extremely suspicious, and you can go back and listen to the interview. I said very explicitly, although I'm paraphrasing now, I don't remember exactly how I said it, but I did say something to the effect that it would be extremely suspicious if they decide that the debris field or where the plane crashed was in the Indian Ocean anywhere. And Georgianne said, well, why that? And I said, number one, because the Indian Ocean is very, very deep. And number two, that means to recover any debris that may have made it to the ocean floor would require countries with the technology, the deep diving technology, to go down and look at it. And there are only a few countries in the world that have that kind of technology. So I said, if it's in the Indian Ocean, don't be surprised if the debris field is salted. So again, I had my suspicions about the whole thing right from the beginning. And sure enough, sleight of hand, as you say, every debris field that they claim to find is the real debris field. Well, it's in the Indian Ocean off the west coast of Australia. And the people putting out that theory, Daniel, never want to talk about, well, then how in the name of sense does a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing end up hundreds of miles south? What got them down there? And they don't want to answer that question either.
Well, it's, of course, there's always the thought that somebody has parked this thing somewhere for use as a future weapon.
Yeah, that's true too. That was an early theory.
You're not gonna stop or shoot down. You're gonna hesitate before you shoot down an airline, that might, or an airplane that might have a heroic story. Like that one where they land in the desert and they rebuild it and fly it back. Where it's sort of like, here it comes. Wow, is this that flight? Your first thought's not going to be, we better shoot it down. Your first thought would be to give it a break.
Yeah.
It's packed full of explosives and something important, and you figure it out too late, it could be deadly.
Well, I've even heard the theory that MH370 was substituted for MH17 that was shot down over the Ukraine. I mean, who knows where this thing is or what happened to it? That's the big problem here. And it's
the North Koreans, they've only got like 15 planes in their entire airline, so
yeah.
maybe they just needed an extra commuter.
Who knows? Who knows? At this stage, Daniel, I'm still not ruling out any hypothesis, including the use of exotic technology. It just went poof, including a natural event that may have created some sort of catastrophic event on the aircraft. But even then, none of these explanations account for how did it end up supposedly. And again, that's part of the narrative. There's no evidence that's compelling that this thing ended up hundreds of miles south of where it should have been, off the coast of Western Australia. The whole thing is a mystery. There's something going on here, and nobody wants to talk about it. That's why I would have another look at the whole Chinese role in this with their satellite when they published that picture of what they thought was a debris field in the South China Sea. Could it have been a catastrophic accident? Yeah, there's a certain body of evidence out there for that. Who knows? One person that did know something is obviously this ambassador in Madagascar, who's looking at all the debris. And like I say, he's in the position of General Patton. He's probably taking a private inventory. He may have even made private notes, which I wouldn't be a bit surprised. And he probably had his suspicions, and somebody took care of him for it. Who knows?
Yes, it's frustrating. Well, to finish out our Franz Ferdinand honorary segment of interesting high-profile deaths by suicide, accident, and assassination, I want to ask you a rather odd question. I know you don't know this one's coming. So
I know, and whenever you say I want to ask you an odd question, I know it's going somewhere.
No, I really.
Yeah, no.
It's too far-fetched. It's even I think this has got to be beyond the pale. But you never know. So, I mean, we've talked many times about what happened after the breakup of the Nazi Empire and what happened specifically to the Eastern European components of their intelligence apparatus, the Belarusian SS, and how they remained in service during the war, or after the war, during the Cold War. Well, along these lines of assassination and high-profile deaths, two thoughts occurred to me. One is, assassins are expensive. This is another thing that was said by the author of Friday, Heinlein. Heinlein pointed out that an assassin costs 10 times more than an ordinary soldier, 100 times more than an ordinary soldier. He said, therefore, they're too valuable to just cash in. You've either got to go get them or you've got to, but the most important thing is they can't get caught. That's what he says. If an ordinary soldier gets caught, you write it off. It's bad. But if an assassin gets caught, you've just lost an incredible amount of money and cash and difficult training and, a lifetime of stuff. And so I thought about this, the incredible resources it takes to carry out assassinations. And we see quite a few assassinations now. It's starting to feel like the 19th century, like Gurkhas looming everywhere. And I'm beginning to wonder again, I brought it up before, about the hints of some kind of global order on the order of Murder Incorporated. Right. And, and of course, we've kicked that idea around with no real light through the cracks. Some people say the Illuminati has a team of ninjas and the ninjas are still here, or, there's an ancient medieval society or whatever you want. But it strikes me that the solution to this is either more localized or more modern. And this one particular group came to mind. And you'll know this name, the werewolves.
Yep.
I began to think about the werewolves, a group specifically dispatched by the Nazis for the purpose of silently killing, dispatching the enemy, and remaining essentially invisible. They move by night, they're unseen, they disappear by day, etc.
Right.
And whatever happened to them is what I began to wonder. You know, if it's true in the East that there would be a remaining remaining vestige of Hitler's apparatus, why would there not necessarily be one in the West, but not necessarily limited to a Germany being pieced up and reconstructed into East and West Berlin after the war? It seems to me their operations wouldn't be primarily restricted to the German fatherland.
No.
So I wanted to ask you if you've ever thought about this notion that one way to have kind of an invisible force of people that have nowhere to go, that are specifically designed for assassination, and are continually motivated to work on the training, is if there was some surviving entity like the werewolves around.
Oh, I absolutely think that there is feedback. I absolutely think that there is a sort of a private club, if you will, an organization, if you will, a Murder Incorporated, you know, Permindex, werewolves, assassins for hire type of business in the world. I have no doubt about it. And I would imagine that pretty much everybody makes use of them from time to time. You know, if they need to go out of house and not use their own assassins, they hire up. You know, there's a body of evidence that Robert Groden uncovered that there may have been mafia assassins from France, actually, that were hired as part of the JFK operation. As far as Nazis go, there is evidence that the werewolves organization or something like it was in existence as late as the 1970s and early 80s. Henrik Kruger, I think an either Austrian or a Danish author, wrote a book several years ago called The Great Heroin Coup, which documents how the heroin drug trade was redesigned in the 1970s. Some of it under the auspices, apparently, of the CIA. There were odd little connections with people around President Nixon and so on and so forth as part of this redesign of the global drug trade when they were cutting out the French connection and moving it to Latin America. Well, he points out that in Latin America, pardon me, the the CIA's Operation Condor, the assassins group in Latin America, and up to and including the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, was being brought about by this Operation Condor assassins group. Well, dig a little deeper and you see that the people involved in Operation Condor were a bunch of Latin American Nazis, with connections, you know, to Otto Skorzeny, to the Belarusians and everybody else. So this organization, at least as far as the Nazis were concerned, yeah, that survived a long time after the war. It probably still is in existence. There's no doubt in my mind that if you want to, let's put it in terms of your template here. If you want to cover up your own country's involvement in something, what do? Well, you use a cutout. And an international guild of assassins of some sort would be a perfect cutout. And you can even go so far as to say, well, we're going to hire so-and-so in case it ever does get tracked. We'll hire somebody to make it look like another group entirely is involved with it. So that doesn't surprise me. And it wouldn't surprise me here in the Malaysian ambassador's case. The problem that you also raise with assassins being caught. This was, you know, you mentioned Franz Ferdinand. Well, this actually happened. Most people do not know this, but the assassins of the Archduke were, most of them, captured by Austria-Hungary, and they were put on trial, including Gavrilo Princip, the guy that actually pulled the trigger on the Archduke. And during the trial, this is very, very interesting, totally unknown in most places, but during the trial, the assassins were obviously interviewed, interrogated, probably tortured to some extent by the Austro-Hungarians before they were hung. Most of them were hung. And the trial transcripts, you can actually go online and dig for these. It requires a lot of digging. But during the trial, many of the members of the Serbian Black Hand organization came out and fingered Masonic groups as having been involved in the establishment of their organization and attempting to drive the Serbian nationalists into assassinating the Archduke. So, you know, is there a professional assassins guild? Well, look at the Serbian Black Hand and the beginning of World War One. Clearly, you have a group of people here that were, to a certain extent, professional assassins, and they pulled it off. So, yeah, there's all sorts of stuff going on.
Well, you could argue that Al-Qaeda is exactly that.
Oh, yeah, I would.
It's being manipulated by economic and political forces, but ultimately is not in and of itself a sourceless, organic movement of the people that sort of crept up, or that it's driven by one or two bad apples. And I don't think that gets talked about enough.
No, it doesn't. I mean, look at the Mujahideen. You know, clearly the CIA was backing these people.
Right.
And clearly, you know, particularly in Osama bin Laden's case, you had somebody that was, it looks to me, more or less picked by professional intelligence agencies. And, you know, I pointed this out in the 9/11 book, that when Prime Minister Blair said that Al-Qaeda was part of some sort of global organization, well, he never makes it clear what organization he's talking about, but he does imply in his remarks that they're dealing with some sort of international extraterritorial entity that has a lot of funding from a lot of places. So yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that this is going on.
Nonprofit of death.
Yeah.
The werewolves in particular interested me just because, first, they're all volunteers. There's about 5,000 of them. Secondly, they're picked from a mix of the Hitler Youth and the Waffen-SS.
Yes.
Of course, we've talked about the Waffen-SS, and most people know what we're talking about who followed your writings. And then what's interesting is the height of their deployment seems to be in the spring of 1945, as the Nazi empire is coming to a close. There's a rash of assassinations of various civil officials and ally-appointed mayors in what were formerly territories run by the Nazis. So ostensibly, this is an extra German operation that these territories have already been lost. They're no longer part of the German Empire. And so by definition, then, their activities of assassination are taking place internationally.
Right.
So the idea that these would deploy at the end, pretty much at the end of the Nazi regime, and then just suddenly stop a couple months later, I guess we'll all turn in our swastikas and go home, strikes me as not what we saw in Latin America and not what we saw in Western Europe. So therefore, I'm not sure why we would see it at all in Western Europe, post-Nazi Germany. And in fact, my question would then be, where would their loyalty switch? Would they then go to work for the East Germans, their sworn enemies? No. Would they go to work for the West, the Allies? I don't think so. In the end, they would end up being masterless samurai, Ronin. They would be.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. I don't think their allegiance ever wavered from Nazism. You know, my research colleague Peter Levenda, who's also done a lot of research and work on this post-war Nazi organization, Peter put it very well in his first book about all of this, called Unholy Alliance, in which he describes Nazism basically as a religion, as a cult, with guns. And that's exactly what I think happened here. These people work more or less for themselves. And, you know, you mentioned Al-Qaeda. There's no doubt in my mind that Nazi connection with radical jihadist groups that really began, if you really want to be honest about it, really began in World War I, when the Kaiser was attempting to militarize and weaponize Islam. This is where it's all coming from, is out of World War I. And of course, the British did the same thing too with Lawrence of Arabia, you know, weaponizing Arabian nationalism to go after the Ottoman Empire. This is where it's coming from. And the Nazis certainly maintained their contacts throughout World War II with these groups, and after World War II, this is documented. So yeah, to be honest with you, Daniel, I've always maintained the notion that this so-called war on terror is really a war against this extraterritorial organization, whatever it is, and that the Islamic world is kind of taking the fall for something that the Central Powers and the Allies began in World War I, and that was continued primarily by the Nazis throughout World War II. Because it's too widespread, it has to have too much funding and financing. It has to have the collusion of major intelligence services even to be able to pull off what allegedly they've been able to pull off.
Well, I found it odd that when Baghdad fell, Condi Rice and Donald Rumsfeld they cited the werewolves. They brought up the werewolves,
yes,
and they said that we have the same situation here, these sort of holdovers that are killing people everywhere. And the problem, historians criticize them for it, because the official story of the werewolves is that they were plagued by logistical issues, and that they petered out into nothing. And therefore, you would think that these two people would have political science advisors telling them you can't use that analogy. But the only way that would make sense to me is if that's not actually the real story available in the intelligence.
yes.
In the intelligence schools, in their manuals, that in their manuals the werewolves go on and last quite a bit longer, whereas in the school textbooks they peter out at the end of the war. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense for Condi and Rumsfeld to cite it. So maybe we were wrong to take them to task. Maybe we should have looked up and went, oh, you're telling us the actual story.
There's so many things. Let me tell you about two things that, to my mind, make this all but probable. I think first of all, Rumsfeld and Rice, and I remember them saying that now that you mention it. I think Rumsfeld and Rice gave us the classical Freudian slip of the tongue. In other words, they disclosed something that probably should not have been disclosed. But let me point out, I mentioned Henrik Kruger and the book The Great Heroin Coup, and a very important book if you ever get a hold of it and read it. But he talks about Operation Condor and the death squads in South America during this period when they're shifting the drug trade from the French Connection and the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia to Latin America. Operation Condor, when I first read the book, I thought, oh my word, because Operation Condor was also the code name that was given to an operation during the Battle of the Bulge, when Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite SS commando, trained a bunch of American English-speaking Germans to wear American uniforms, go behind American lines during the last German offensive of the war. And what they did was they would change road signs and so on to, just make a mess of American communications and so on. That was also codenamed Operation Condor. Well, interestingly enough, of course, Otto Skorzeny survives the war. He was a big player during his life in this post-war Nazi international thing. He hosted the 1960s Barcelona terrorist summit, which included the Grand Mufti al-Husseini and Yasser Arafat and, a bunch of people that were connected with radical Islam. So Skorzeny emerges in all of this, and it's particularly interesting when you get to the Latin American version of Operation Condor, because what do you have? Well, a lot of these drug squads were Medellin cartel were trained by SS officers, just like, the SS was training Green Berets in Vietnam and so on and so forth. So no, they didn't crawl into the woodwork. And the second fact I want to mention that, again, to my mind, brings out the fact that we're not dealing with a war on terror, but we're dealing with some sort of war against a highly organized extraterritorial entity, is a statement that was made by a Russian economist in Pravda in July of 2001. I wrote about this in the 9/11 book. Her name was Dr. Tatiana Koryagina. And she made the statement in Pravda in July of 2001, 2 months before 9/11, that the United States was shortly going to be attacked by so-called terrorist incidents that would be very serious on American soil, and that this would be the act or action of a well-financed global group of a very few people with financing in the trillions of dollars. And it would be done to create a new order in the world. And, you know, again, it's one thing for her to say that, but when you get Tony Blair saying more or less the same thing after the fact, when you get Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice saying kind of the same thing after the fall of Baghdad, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I almost totally forgot about that. Yeah, I think they're letting the cat out of the bag here. Something else is going on than run-of-the-mill terrorism.
Well, of course, Operation Condor came to mind for me too, because that administration was rife with it. Cheney was one of the architects, and then you have Rumsfeld flying down there on the anniversary of the death of the assassination of Allende, and you have him meeting with the Chileans saying, "I got to do this." He was criticized for flying so many miles. He's like, "I wouldn't do this. It wasn't important." And it's after the assault on Afghanistan, but before our launch. Or it's before our launch, our war against Iraq. And, you know, then lo and behold, he comes back as an advocate of something that sounds like a cleaned up version of what the Vervolves are trying to do. It's like he's saying, well, we have to have this global cooperation to end terrorism. And so the expansion of Clinton's black sites becomes dramatic, and the use of enhanced interrogation techniques or torture becomes dramatic. And you have, but more importantly, you have the question of a lot of these activities, whether or not Americans are perpetrating them or they're being perpetrated by the enemy. It's a constant flux of who did what. And that all explodes after Rumsfeld's visit to Chile.
Yeah.
And so, and it explodes not just, it's like when you have the ramming, the car murder where you ram somebody with a car in Charlottesville, and now it's happening all over the world. People are, it's almost like, it's not just straight up copycat, but it's like people get inspired by this. Oh yeah, that's right, you can do this. You start to see now false flag operations from that moment on, from the moment that Rumsfeld visits Chile. You start to see them become almost the norm, or at least the fact that you can't trust what you see. So it makes me wonder about things like the longevity of some organization like the Werewolves. But to switch to segment 2 of our show, this is
before you do, let me take a break.
Break, and I'll have a scotch.
Let me take a brief break.
Finish a scotch. I should have queued up the Jeopardy's theme song. Let me see. I won't be able to find it in time. Ladies and gentlemen, I would cue up the Jeopardy theme song while Dr. Farrell's gone, but I think this is not one of his long breaks. If it were, you would hear the frantic whipping of instant iced tea in the background. Nope, just books. Books in the background. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel a little bit like Mr. Rogers in his neighborhood. Let's take a look at Dr. Farrell's bookshelf. See if I can switch the camera over to Dr. Farrell's bookshelf. There it is. What can we get out of Dr. Farrell's bookshelf? It's hard to recognize anything. It's hard to read. It's fuzzy. Fuzzy, what's there? Nope, I can't tell. I can't read any of it.
Apologies.
No worries, Dr. Farrell. All right, so we're back. So in segment 2 of our show, this is about unexploded bombs.
Jeez.
Unfortunately, I could not come up with a single mascot for this segment of the show. I can't think of a person that I could associate with.
Slim Pickens riding the hydrogen bomb.
Oh, there you go. All
Dr.
right.
Strangelove.
Slim Pickens. So we in Frankfurt, they just got through evacuating 60,000 people.
Right.
And, it's because they found a 4,000-pound bomb.
Well, it's 4,000 pounds now. Okay.
4,000 pounds at a construction site for faculty buildings around the Goethe University, which I found ironic.
Mm-hmm.
They suggest that it's possibly a British Royal Air Force unexploded piece of ordnance. And they also suggest or mention in the news that this is in close proximity to large sectors of Frankfurt's banking elite and the German central bank.
Right.
And so, and I want to read a quote from this. The German authorities have calculated that around 15% of the bombs dropped during World War II failed to explode, and more than 2,000 pounds of unexploded weaponry are found every year. In the rush to rebuild after the war, Germans often just buried the ammunitions, so many of them are turning up now. So that makes sense. Pave over it. That sounds right. And also, there's no mention of whether or not, 80% of those 15% of unexploded ordnance are actually RAF ordnance. I don't know country by country what the ratio is, but I'd be curious. How many of the U.S. pieces didn't blow up? But my question to you is: does this bother you? When I look at this, something bothers me, and it bothers me that they evacuate 60,000 people for this bomb. They found many bombs before. I don't hear of that scale of an evacuation.
Bingo.
And it doesn't escape my notice that the evacuation occurs from precisely the area occupied by not only the German central bank, but the offices of the most powerful of Frankfurt's banking elite. And let's assume that all of that stuff is secure to ordinary prying eyes and hands, etc. But when you've got 60,000 people out of there, you've got a lot of time, a lot of freedom from noise constraints, and a lot of ability to do pretty much whatever you want in their house while they're gone.
Yep.
So I just saw this and thought I would ask you about it. Unexploded bombs for 1,000. Anything there? It looks weird to me.
Look, I've already blogged about this, and yeah, it looks weird. I have the same suspicions you do. The suspicion has been voiced on
Dr. Farrell. I have no suspicions. I'm just asking questions as they occur.
Oh yeah, bull roar you are. I know the way your mind works. You forget this. But look, I have the same suspicions. And it's already been a matter of conjecture and speculation on sites like Zero Hedge and so on. I had a member of the site from Germany email me, I won't use his name, but saying, oh no, you're all wet. This goes on all the time in Germany. And they're not going to evacuate the security of the Bundesbank, which is there in Frankfurt. They're not going to evacuate the security of the European Central Bank, which conveniently is also there in Frankfurt. That tells us who's really calling the shots. Their suspicion tied to the fact that the Germans have completed their gold repatriation, their planned gold repatriation from the Bank of England, from the Bank of France, and then from the New York Federal Reserve several years ahead of schedule. It was announced by the Bundesbank earlier this year, and they have a number of discrepancies, the way it looks to me, to account for. Because there's not really been anything I've seen that indicates that this gold has been audited with the precision it needs to be. However, there's another story, another possibility here that looms large in the picture that I did not blog about publicly, that I did not want to do because it is so speculative. But I'll share the speculation here. Deutsche Bank has its headquarters, of course, in Frankfurt. and it's in a big building, a modern twin tower, incidentally, skyscraper structure in Frankfurt. And Deutsche Bank is under a lot of threat in Europe, particularly from Italy. The Banco di Siena de Monte Paschi, or whatever, that old Italian bank, is connected with Deutsche Bank. The Italian prosecutors are preparing all sorts of cases. Deutsche Bank has been at the center of what I think is kind of a covert economic war taking place between the United States and Germany. It's been hit with heavy fines in this country. Deutsche Bank was implicated in 9/11. It was one of the major financial groups that had several puts and shorts options placed for the week of 9/11, precisely against American and United Airlines. Lufthansa was another German firm implicated in all of this. So Deutsche Bank is also the world's if I'm not mistaken, the world's largest single holder of credit default swap derivatives. And of course, that's a lot of bad paper on their books. So I suspect, everybody else is suspecting this has something to do with the German gold repatriation and so on. And that's the way I blogged it. But I also suspect that this is mighty convenient for Deutsche Bank to go in during this evacuation and have the shredding party, so to speak, and take care of anything on the books that might be a little untoward. So who knows? I find it mighty suspicious, any way you slice it, that this convenient evacuation occurs during a period when one of the world's major banks is under investigation for all sorts of financial malfeasance, money laundering, you name it. They're under investigation for it, not just in this country, but other European countries. It's a major player, I think, in what I've been calling the hidden system of finance. I think it's right up there with Chase Manhattan and Hong Kong, Shanghai, Royal Bank of Scotland, Banque de Paris, Pays-Bas, and so on. I think that it has something to do with this hidden system of finance, and somebody is doing a lot of cover you-know-what going on here.
Well, it occurred to me that, the obvious concern would be around money and protecting the vaults and things like that to the person, but I wouldn't be focused on that. I would be
I wouldn't either.
Whether there was document destruction.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and because that would target offices that would have security, but not the same level, and that security would most likely be evacuated. But
right.
So
right.
The viewer's response that security wouldn't be dismissed presumes the non-complicity of the financial institution in the action.
Right.
Was any action. So this is all speculative, but it just struck me as odd.
It is odd. It's too odd, and it's too coincidental, particularly with Deutsche Bank being under such scrutiny right now. And like I say, I think Deutsche Bank is a major player in what I've been calling the hidden system of finance. And as a result, if any of those records were to escape, and I think it's connected, don't get me wrong, I do think it's all connected with the gold story as well. And the Bundesbank is being, very, very tight-lipped, as central banks are wont to be concerning their gold reserves. Germany supposedly has the second highest gold reserves in the world. So, that makes it, at least in one sense, that puts it on a pretty hefty strategic footing economically.
Well, that brings us to the Copernicus segment of our show. I debated Mork and Mindy, Copernicus, and I weighed them, and I ended up with Copernicus because I did have an actual question about him. So this segment of the show is segment 3, another run at the Fermi paradox.
Oh, geez.
For those who need the Fermi paradox restated, you can go into Wikipedia. There's actually about 5 things in the chain of the argument, but it actually essentially means there's statistically enough planets in the cosmos that we can already detect that it's not only likely, statistically likely, or high probability that aliens exist on other planets. That's too tame. It goes into how fast one develops interplanetary travel, et cetera, and ends up with the final conclusion that the chances are highly unlikely that aliens are not already here on our planet, and have been and were long ago, and have been for a long time.
Well, if I may add a corollary, the other side of the Fermi paradox, and Fermi himself was a believer in this corollary, is that given, this is all going back to the Drake equation, given the statistical high probability of intelligent life out there somewhere, Fermi drove the paradox in the other direction. Because what he said was, if that's the case, then we should have been contacted already, and because we haven't been, that means there's probably nothing out there. So he took the corollary in a very different direction. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's an interesting lead-in to where I'm going with this, because the Fermi paradox, I'm interested less in the content of it than the structure of the argument.
Okay.
So, I mean, Fermi ended up finishing the Fermi paradox with, all right, the world should already be teeming with aliens. Where is everybody?
Exactly.
Which is what you were alluding to. So I have a colleague, and my colleague mentioned something to me the other day in passing. We almost never talk about these things, but we've never talked about these things, but he mentioned to me the other day in passing that he believes in UFOs. And I asked him why. And, what evidence do you have? And he says, I'm not basing it on evidence. I'm basing it on a logical structure of thought. And he says, I'm starting with the observations of unusual craft. I'm starting with the sheer number of observations, the similarities between those observations, and what things they usually have in common, such as the ability to navigate quickly in odd directions that ordinary spacecraft can't do,
right,
and the ability to levitate, float, or have propulsion that ordinary aircraft can't do, or spacecraft can't do, and within our atmosphere. And he says that I start with it as a postulate that, though it's an experimental one, he says, if we assume that there's something to those observations, that in fact there's too many people not to be seeing a real phenomenon. He says, if you just set aside skepticism about that, then by definition, you must conclude from that postulate that if some of these observations are real, then anti-gravity must exist. And if anti-gravity and alternate forms of propulsion must exist, then alternative navigation as a corollary must exist, because if you can't control the thing that is being propelled, then it kind of, it eliminates the problem. So he says, therefore, I think anti-gravity is almost a compulsory belief. You must believe that it exists off of the sheer number of observations. And I pointed out to him that does not require aliens.
Right.
And he pointed out that's true. It's just that he doesn't know of another explanation. But he basically starts with observations. That's data point 1, data point 2, therefore anti-gravity, data point 3, therefore alternate propulsion, etc. And there were a couple of other points in our discussion. So one is, just as a corollary, there is this craft called AHR, the Advanced Hypersonic Weapon. And it's a craft that the U.S. military has created that can reach Mach 5, which is in the double digits of thousands of miles per hour. But essentially, it's still a glider. It is taken to a Mach 5 speed by a missile, and then they let go. And because they have no control over it. And a missile, the problem with a missile is it has, based on trigonometry, a very predictable trajectory. And that causes two problems. One, you can easily predict where it is and shoot it down. And the other is that it can trigger automatic response systems of various governments against nukes and trigger a nuclear catastrophe. Because, again, it will behave like a missile. So what you need is you need to propel this thing with a missile to get up to speed, but then let the missile go. And now you have the control of a glider that allows you to manipulate it and take unconventional approach vectors.
Right.
And so that is seemingly the height of our public technology. And it makes it seem that anti-gravity is in fact not being held back, that it's not like our government has figured this out and they're keeping it secretly. They're putting an inordinate amount of effort into things that use just crazy analog or
Mm-hmm.
you know, donkey pushing a cart kind of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I used to think, Dr. Farrell, that you know this is all black ops and black budget, and you know all of this technology is being kept secret. But
Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
sorry, I accidentally hit mute. But every other technology, I used to think it's all black ops and stuff, but every other technology quickly comes to the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, for instance, you've got all of the supersonic weapons that come to the private sector from around 2005 through 2014, where various police departments are getting these supersonic weapons, plasma-driven supersonic weapons that we used against Iraq in the Iraq War. They're using them against crowds around the Crowd of 20 meeting and against the protesters of the NATO summit and even Occupy Wall Street in New York City.
Yep.
Stuff comes out too fast to think that if we had some form of alternate propulsion, that it wouldn't come out. And so this brings me to the final point here, which is the parallel with Copernicus. And this is his observation. He says, look, a very simple thing, similar thing happened when Copernicus observed that the Earth rotates around the sun.
Mm-hmm.
That people said, you know, oh, no way, that can't be true. But once you just entertain the hypothesis for a moment, once you decide that let's just start, what if it were true? He says, then everything you see around you begins to support it. And pretty soon you cannot any longer resist the thing that you've been handed. In some ways, evolution can be viewed that way. You know, even if you don't accept all the principles of evolution, just take natural selection. There's a website called the Darwin Rewards, which is for people that do stupid things that end up resulting in their deaths. And I'm reminded of a rapper over the course of this previous eclipse. The rapper publicly announced that he was going to watch the eclipse in its entirety without glasses and be in the full line of sight. He said because ancient man didn't have glasses, therefore it should be safe. He doesn't believe all of this nonsense. And immediately after the eclipse, he announced he canceled all of his tour engagements, and it was announced that he was going into a medical facility for some form of eye injury. And
gee, go figure.
As bad as I feel for him, it's really, I don't have any schadenfreude, and it hurts. But I'm like, oh God, you know, I don't wish blindness on anybody. But that's an example of natural selection working. If you're stupid, you don't live as long. Then the bad things tend to happen to people that just, you know, I believe that everything is relative. It's the same to walk in front of a bus as not to walk in front of a bus. Let me prove it to you. Bam. Oh, wow. Darwin Award just for you. So the evolution is like that. It's self-reinforcing. If you just entertain it for a moment, you start to see reinforcing evidence. And so my question is twofold. The question A is, why can't we do more of this kind of experimental epistemologizing? I don't see a lot of that in Western thought, that we are able to not start with this is true, therefore, or this is false, therefore, but start with, well, let's assume for a moment that this were true. What would that look like? Right, and then we work it out and see if what we get matches the evidence empirically. Right. It doesn't seem like we're doing as a culture much of that kind of thought. And then question B is, what do you think of my colleague's analysis of the probability that anti-gravity exists, and my corollary of I don't think it is government secret projects. There seems to be, to me, the simpler answer is it's ET, because if the government had it, we'd know by now.
Okay. Let's do the epistemology thing. The methodology that you're outlining is, okay, assume that this is true for the sake of argument, then what happens? What does the evidence look like? That's basically the methodology I've been following, you know, ever since I wrote Giza Death Star. Assume something to be true and then look at the peculiarities of whatever it is you're looking at, in this case, the Great Pyramid.
You could call it entertain the argument method, or prima facie entertain the argument.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. You know, I call it high octane speculation, but the formal analysis is basically assume that something is true for, as a mathematical given, as it were, and then what does the evidence look like? So when you do that, yeah, you end up with a different picture of things. I think you end up ultimately with very strong cases for all of this stuff. Your real question is, why aren't we doing more of this? And I think part of it is, I'm going to use the phrase of Dr. Webster Tarpley here for a minute, because I think he was on to something in his research and writings over the years. He calls it epistemological warfare. There's really been a kind of epistemological warfare going on in the West, particularly in the last 100 to 150 years, and you see it in almost all fields. It's not restricted to things that have to do with culture. It has, you find it in physics if you know what to look for. You find it in biology. You find it in the hard sciences. So there's a kind of epistemological warfare against this notion that if such and such is true, then what does it look like? And I think a lot of it also is at least in the United States, I can't speak for Europe or Canada or Australia or places like that, but in this country, a lot of it is the blowback from the Kennedy assassination, because of course the CIA, in response to the fact that Americans weren't just leaping onto the Warren Commission report and adopting it as their worldview. If anything, the reverse happened. The CIA, of course, came out with the plan to denigrate all of this as conspiracy theory, and similar methods were incidentally used with the UFO from a very early period. And you see this time and time again. The classic example of it being the Condon Report, the U.S. Air Force's 1967 study with Dr. Condon. Again, the whole thing there was to denigrate the people that believed in UFOs as being kind of nuts and quacks. The problem they had was people like Dr. James McDonald or Dr. Alan Hayek, eventually broke ranks with the government and began to look at the UFO question very seriously and to apply as much rigor as they could to it. So I think your point there is very valid. I think we're in kind of an epistemological swamp right now that makes people doing the stuff that I do, or that Richard Dolan does, or Peter Levenda, or anybody else in this rather strange alternative field of research. People are not trained to see what we're doing. I try over and over again to tell people, well, I'm doing high octane speculation. I'm making a kind of a prima facie argument. It's up to you whether you accept the argument or have a different idea about what's going on with the same data set or not. That's what we're doing, and that's a time-honored academic thing, and it's being carefully weeded out of American society and culture. So I think you're onto something there. I think there is an epistemological warfare going on where people are just quite literally trained not to think, or not to be able to think in that fashion. Now, you mentioned the hypersonic aircraft and the anti-gravity question. Let me open the discussion on that with an observation. The idea behind this hypersonic craft is not new, and in fact, once again, ding, 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 guess who thought of it first? Well, it was a Nazi scientist by the name of Erich Zenger, S-A with an umlaut, N-G-E-R, who proposed a world glider, quite literally, and the same thing was going to be used. Rockets were going to get it up into suborbital status, and then it would glide and skip on the atmosphere and be able to bomb things all over the world and return and land like an aircraft in Germany. He called it, interestingly enough, one of the terms he called it was a space shuttle. But anyway, the idea...
It kind of looks like that in the drawings. It looks exactly like a space shuttle.
Yeah.
And on Star Trek. And then on top of that, they're saying the same thing as the Nazis. The creators say the idea is that the U.S. will be able to bomb any place in the world in 1 hour.
Yeah, and do it with quick mobilization. which leads to the question, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, it leads to the question, well, why would we be developing that if we have all of these other technologies in the black budget, you know, EM drive, that's the big thing that they're talking about publicly now. The Chinese are testing it, NASA's testing it, and blah, 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 on and on we go. Why wouldn't anti-gravity come out by now? And I think there's several answers to that, and they're all kind of interconnected. The first one is, number one, is if we assume that it exists, if we take your friend's argument and accept it again for the sake of argument, if we assume that it exists, then who has it? Well, in my opinion, it's not the United States government that has it. If anything, that technology is going to be locked up in corporate proprietary secrets. We have to remember the American war machine, the Nazi war machine, the French, the Russian, you know, anybody with a war machine basically is dealing with corporations. I mean, you know, think of Krupp, think of Boeing, think of Lockheed Martin, think of British Aerospace. They're dealing with corporations that the governments contract out to create a particular weapons platform for them. And they hand them gobs of money in order to do this. So you're dealing, I think, first of all, with the field of anti-gravity. You're dealing with a technology that, number one, is so dangerous. You know, I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you have a technology that can manipulate the fabric of space-time on the laboratory bench, potentially that gives you a weaponization technology that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. We are talking potentially planet-busting, star-busting stuff here. So your first concern is you've got to figure out a way to keep that technology from falling into the hands of people that would misuse it. And I think that's been primarily the chief concern of these people all along. You know, it goes all the way back to J.P. Morgan and Nikola Tesla. When Morgan heard about what Tesla was planning to do with his wireless beaming of electricity, the other thing that Tesla eventually disclosed was, yeah, you can weaponize this stuff, and it's pretty bad. But that's their first problem. They've got a proliferation problem. The second thing that I think you're dealing with in that respect is it's also a proprietary technology. In other words, Lockheed Martin or Boeing or British Aerospace or whoever develops an anti-gravity technology, they're going to keep it under close guard even from the governments that have created the research. And then on top of this, let's add the third factor, and this is Richard Dolan's observation, and I think, again, he was dead on when he made this observation. And I've kind of picked up with it and ran with it in my secret space program speculations, is that at the end of World War II, if you're the American national security establishment, you've got essentially three strategic problems that are confronting you. Number one, you've got the communist bloc. Number two, in my calculation, you've got a post-war Nazi thing. You don't know where it is. You suspect they're up to something, but you don't know exactly what. This clearly emerges after the Roswell incident, where the U.S. Air Force is all of a sudden concerned about, well, where the heck are the Horton brothers and what are they doing? You know, well, why would Roswell call them to make that kind of statement? But they do. So they've got this post-war Nazi thing that's a problem. And thirdly, they've got a UFO problem. That's very clear. So what do? Well, you have to set up a program that's like the Manhattan Project that's is going to last several decades. It's going to require gobs of money. You can't tax the American people to death to create a show of force to emulate flying saucers. So you have to finance it with completely hidden means. This is why I think that whole system got started. Anti-gravity, I do think, exists. There are a number of indicators. Once again, for people listening to this, if you don't know the book, get it. Let me see if I can find it here. A very important book. written by Dr. Paul Laviolette, and it's called Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, Tesla, UFOs, and Advanced Aerospace Technology. I spoke with Dr. Laviolette at the last Secret Space Program conference. A tremendously important book, because what he does is he shows the patents that have actually existed since the 1950s for this stuff. He recounts a few anecdotal stories on top of it, but in my opinion, it does exist. Why isn't it out of the bag? Final point here, point number 4, is if you've got this technology and it is manipulating the fabric of space-time, what you in effect have, Daniel, is you have an open energy system. You have the potential for limitless energy that's available to anybody who knows how to access it. And that's the problem. The technology ultimately is rather simple. So the problem here is you have had for at least 1,000 years, if not longer, a closed physics and economic system. And the two things always go together. Physics and finance reflect each other. This is always the case. If you've got a petrodollar system based on presumably diminishing supply of a scarce resource, the financial system reflects that cosmology. So if you all of a sudden introduce a limitless energy paradigm, one thing that goes out the window immediately is a closed debt-based system of monetized debt, because ultimately energy resources are no longer scarce. And the bottom line here is, I don't think the financial elite, which has been functioning for at least a millennium on a closed system cosmology, even remembers how to function with an open system cosmology. We haven't seen that since Babylon, you know. So the problem there that they have is, if they're going to introduce this technology, they have to, number one, monitor the proliferation problem. Number two, they have to completely rethink the entire financial paradigm. This is what I was trying to get at in Babylon's Banksters and Financial Vipers of Venice. And the problem there is, when they do rethink it, they keep coming up with the same old paradigm. And in this case, the paradigm is limitless infinite debt forever ad infinitum. They can't think in any other way. So I think your friend's correct. I think his basic argument is correct. My hesitation would be, like you, to say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's ET, which is where they want to drive it.
Well, it's interesting. I keep thinking about the evolutionary equivalent of this argument, and thinking that you know, you don't have to accept the whole thing to accept some of the parts.
Right.
But I find it interesting that you've done it before, but you're relating it again back to the economic implications of limitless energy. The only question I have is, does anti-gravity immediately imply that no, by definition, does the technology of anti-gravity imply that no fuel is used, or that no resources are drained or used up, that it's essentially cost-free and impact-free? I would think that would violate certain laws of physics, again, and that is probably part of the definition, that it is not part of Newtonian physics. But my question is, we don't know that if anti-gravity technology exists, that it is costless, do we?
No, we don't know that. In fact, if anything, from what I've seen, the technologies that are out there that Dr. Laviolette and some other people have discussed in their publications is rather expensive to produce. Mark McCandlish, in the 2014 Secret Space Program conference in San Mateo, gave a really good talk about the so-called alien reproduction vehicle that was supposedly reverse engineered by American engineers from supposedly crashed extraterrestrial craft. And in this vehicle, there were large artificially made quartz crystals that were, 8 or 9 feet in length that were used as dielectrics around the circumference of this vehicle. If you can stop and think about how much money it would cost to make an artificial quartz crystal that's several inches thick and several feet wide, and do so with a minimum of lattice structure defects, Frankel defects and so on. That's an extraordinarily expensive investment. So I'm not saying that these things wouldn't be costly. The problem is, once you've got them, it's like a fusion reactor. Once you start the dang thing, it's going to be putting out almost as much energy as you're putting in. And in fact, the idea that a coefficient of performance, and please hear me, there's a difference between coefficient of performance and over unity, which is usually the word that people use to describe this stuff. But you can have a localized system which does not violate the macro paradigm of the second law of thermodynamics, where a coefficient of performance is going to be 1 or greater. That's the problem. And the two get confused in a lot of people's mind. So I do think that once you've got this technology, you've pretty much got a handle on an energy source that is nothing like what we have seen previously in human history. It's a paradigm changer in almost every way. So the real question is, how does this technology impact human society? And I don't think anybody has a good answer to that. It is interesting to note that Daniel Estulin, the guy that covers the Bilderberg meetings and has been doing so for a very long time, has pointed out that the Bilderbergs began in the 1980s to make a regular feature of their private discussions the topic of controlled fusion. Well, why would they be concerned about that? And again, I think the answer is it's because they know it's a financial paradigm changer. And if it's, let's go a step further, Daniel. So much of our world's geopolitics, particularly in the last 2 centuries or so, is all tied around energy. Just think of Kaiser Wilhelm and the Berlin to Baghdad railway. Well, why is he interested in that? Well, answer, oil. Why were the British trying to oppose it? Answer, oil. Think of the Chinese Silk Road project now and all of the oil resources in the region and Russia's involvement with it. Well, again, our geopolitics is now being acted out on the presupposition, the cosmological presupposition, that energy is based on declining resources. Think of the paradigm changer in geopolitics if all of a sudden anti-gravity were released to the world. Okay, it would change the geopolitics overnight. And this, again, has got to be of concern to the elites. How do you control, let's say, Rwanda, all of a sudden having possession of anti-gravity technology? Well, they wouldn't need the West, they wouldn't need their semi-colonial status, and so on and so forth. It would be a game changer, not to mention the military implications of it. We need to remember, as I pointed out in several books, when the United States was testing its hydrogen bombs, particularly in the Castle series of tests, that there was a lot of UFO activity that was taking place during those tests, and the Air Force actually activated Project Blue Book for these things. So they know what all of these technologies will imply, and I think that's one reason, not necessarily that they're keeping them secret. I think we see, as a matter of fact, and particularly have seen since 9/11, a slow but steady increase of the trickle of information about some of these technologies coming out into the public. The EM drive that China's testing, and so on and so forth.
Well, as we experiment with things like ion propulsion and the EM drive, I can't help but observe that, our focus still seems utterly banal in some ways. I mean,
It is.
It is, conventional in terms of conventional physics. We're dealing with things that seem to deny certain laws of physics, or seem to impact our thinking about quantum physics, even if those impacts are limited to the quantum scale. But we keep focusing on electromagnetism and microwaves.
Mm-hmm.
And especially the AHW vehicle. I believe I read the engine is propelled by essentially microwaves bouncing around inside the engine. And I can't help but also observe that, the Russians, there's not much study. Like if you Google the phrase impact of microwaves on the environment, you won't find much.
Right.
Most importantly, you'll find that unlike most Google searches, the first page is consumed with academic reports, the abstracts of which say it's really inconclusive. And if you click on Google News and look at the news reports, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. And so no one is really saying that, no one that is saying very loudly that microwave technology could be producing a fairly negative effect on human, plant life, the environment, and the world. But the Russians did a study back when microwave ovens came out.
Yep.
And the Russians asserted that the potential impact on human life, plant life, was severe and should be cause for concern. Of course, we've ruled that out. We've said that now we can't reproduce that, and we think that microwave ovens are safe, et cetera. And you know how big a concern that was in the 70s when that stuff started happening, when people started putting microwave ovens in their homes. But I can't help but wonder if our development of these technologies have less of an impact on consumption of particular environmental resources and more of an impact on actually destroying environmental resources.
Oh, great observation. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The Russians, let's address this in two ways. The Russian studies, if you're familiar with the researches and books of Lieutenant Colonel Bearden, who really made most of his career out of tracking what was going on in the Soviet Union in terms of what he was calling scalar physics. But essentially it was microwave research of all types and combinations. The Soviets were experimenting with microwave interferometry for health reasons, for electronic warfare jamming reasons, you name it, they were doing it. So the Russian response to this does not surprise me. They know, and they knew at a very early period, how deleterious the effects of microwaves could be. I'm not surprised about that. One of the things I think that in terms of this country that has been an overlooked subject when you talk about microwaves and the environment are precisely those cases in ufology where people, there's a famous case in Kansas, I forget where it was, but where people have seen and reported discs or some sort of contraption landing on their farmland, and it will leave a burnt, scorched circle in the ground. But interestingly enough, over time, that circle has remained. Plants won't grow there, and rainwater will not soak into the ground. It will collect in little beads. And what that's an indicator of is that the soil has been heavily ionized. And that in turn is the result, and one of the results, if you take microwaves, extremely powerful beams of microwaves, and beam it at dirt or things like that, you're going to get the ionization of the soil, and you're going to get a similar result. So in other words, it is an environmental problem. For the same reason, if you worked for AT&T back in the day when microwaves were used for switching across the country, AT&T had these big towers in certain places in the country. One up in Kansas I know very well, north of Topeka, where the old AT&T switching apparatus was. They had these big microwave horn antennas out there. And, you would be told as an AT&T technician, you do not want to stand in front of these things while they're on. You'll be fried. You'll end up a little piece of charcoal. They were that powerful. So they do have an environmental impact. I suspect that the reason that it was downplayed in this country, one of the reasons it may have been downplayed, was precisely the UFO issue, where you had these cases of ionized soil and so on that indicated extremely powerful microwaves were in operation. So I've never bought the idea that these things were not a health hazard. You know, I have a microwave just like everybody else, but I don't use it very much.
We certainly have a dearth of discussion about it in the English-speaking world.
Yep.
I've never had a Google search come up so sparse.
Yeah.
I want to quote Hans Hertel, a Swiss scientist, and I believe it was part of the Russian studies. And that may not be accurate, but this is him talking in the early days about the effects of microwaves, and he's limiting it to a study of microwave ovens and food, but potential external impacts. And he says, quote, "There are no atoms, molecules, or cells of any organic system able to withstand such a violent destructive power for any extended period of time.
Yep.
Not even in the low energy range of milliwatts," which is an odd statement. "This is how microwave cooking heat is generated. Friction from this violence in water molecules. Structures of molecules are torn apart. Molecules are forcefully deformed, called structural isomerism, and thus become impaired in quality." Again, a little highlight there. And you know this because anyone that has ever owned a microwave, the common wisdom is cover your food. If you're like me and take the bachelor approach, I prefer the spattered microwave with the stuff, the stalactites on the ceiling. But the chili from a year ago.
Oh, please.
But what I do know works in a microwave, I've never found covering it matters. What I do know is a couple of drops of water in that food will make sure it gets good and cooked. Based on what he's saying, and it's because of the manipulation of water. And this brings us to the segment of our show that begins the winding down to what I call just the natural conclusions of Dr. Farrell, but what you seem to conclude are things I knew we were going to in the first place. I have no idea how you arrive at those. But, I am thinking about high-profile deaths of Malaysian consuls looking at wreckage. I am thinking about clearing out Frankfurt and pulling financial records. I am, of course, thinking about alternative forms of propulsion and microwaves as I bring us to the segment of our show that revolves around Cuba, which I like to call the eardrum of the Caribbean, both because and recent events. And so this segment, which I haven't thought of a mascot other than Fidel Castro because I just don't have one. Maybe Ricky Ricardo. So the Ricky Ricardo segment of our show, segment 4, weird news, that Cuba thing, and the Navy accidents both stink to high heaven. Is the segment. And this again comes off the heels of I'll remind you of our discussion on microwaves, on the Fermi paradox and alternative propulsion, on unexploded bombs and clearing out Frankfurt, and on high-profile assassinations of people looking for Malaysian airliners. So, and this also falls into the also known as Dr. Farrell told you so category because, of course, you've been blogging about this. So a couple of things stick out, and I have several questions about this whole thing. And I know more about the Cuba thing than the Navy accidents, but I've got them in mind. So for specific reasons, and I'll announce one of those reasons. So it was not that recently that a major weapons manufacturer announced that they had created a microwave gun for sale by the U.S. to the U.S. military for the purpose of disabling small ships. Now they said motorboats, like Somali pirate type ships and stuff like that. And I'll just stop there with that, stupid claim, which doesn't make enough money to justify the weapon, and also the issue of scalability and shrinking down technology. And move into the segment, which is, all right, so starting in mid-November 2016, we get these so-called sonic attacks on various U.S. diplomats in Cuba. And certain things come to mind. I have like 5 key questions about this. So question number 1 is around this. I can see no reason for Cuban intelligence to do this.
No, I can't either.
The logic being offered in the standard explanation is, well, they've been harassing U.S. diplomats for years, following them around and watching them. Well, that's what you do. You watch them, you follow them around. They're foreigners. And when they go out in your country, you want to see who they're having dinner with. But that doesn't mean you set up, dare we say, microwave guns or something and point them to their hotel room, make them all sick, and potentially create a nuclear or an international incident.
Right.
So the normal thing that, that when you are teaching junior, junior's 5 years old and you want to introduce him to the notion that not everything is what they say on the news. You start with the two simple words, cui bono. And you basically ask who benefits from this. It isn't the Cuban secret police. No. Okay. So I began to zoom in on one other element of this, that some major high-ranking diplomat in the U.S. didn't call them sonic attacks. He called them health attacks. And that phrase stuck in the news too. So health attacks, sonic attacks have been used in conjunction. And this all happens at a point where we're watching not only a lot of debate over whether there was hacking in the election, but also the revelation that the hacking of Equifax, they had another hack a few months ago. We didn't really pay much attention to. So I wondered if hackers could produce something like this, but they would still need the technology, the actual weaponry to do it. The weaponry would have to be in place for some foreign party to get control of it. So that implies there could be multiple parties in play, a party that has the weaponry but wasn't intending to use it, and a party that got access to the weaponry and doesn't own it. Those are just speculations. But I began to think, Dr. Farrell, what is the history of this up till now? This can't have just come out of nowhere. And I think what has caught the American and Western press by surprise is this just came out of nowhere. And so, but for those of us that have been watching this show, I beg to differ. So I want to mention first Operation Northwoods, which was never carried out, we think, or supposedly, but it is a proposed series of assassinations, sinking of boats, and other things in Cuba.
And hijacking of airliners.
Things that were designed to do one of two things, either get the U.S. into a war or to cause them to depose Castro and to get the government overthrown. And who was involved in operations like this? Well, David Ferry, Guy Bannister, people whose names we know if you've watched Oliver Stone's movie on JFK.
General Lemnitzer.
Yes, and I can't help but think also of Operation Mongoose and any number you could probably count on. These are not enough fingers to count the number of secret operations aimed at Cuba during the Cold War. So I overlay that. I put that template on one side, the timeline of operations against Cuba, and then on the other side I put another timeline. And here's my timeline. In 2000, sonic-based weapons were used by the Navy after the USS Cole attack. And they began to be used in both Iraq wars. In 2005, cruise liners began deploying sonic weapons on deck to stop Somali pirates, in other words, disable motorboats that were against them. 2009, Pittsburgh acquired these to use against protesters at the Crowd of 20 meeting. In 2011, an LRAD was used in New York City against the Occupy Wall Street movement. In 2012, an LRAD was used in Chicago against people protesting the NATO summit. In 2012, a sonic device was deployed, probably an LRAD. It was an American LRAD, that's confirmed, was deployed in London during the Olympics. The Londonese were defending themselves. They say they didn't use it, but it's there in case they have to, in case of terrorism. And one thing that came out is, don't worry about this. It's already in use. It shoots down Somali pirates, and it's highly directional. And it's like, oh, okay. Thanks for that.
Ain't that convenient?
Yes, it's very handy for us. And then it's basically a gun that that kills you with sound or causes you serious problems, and also breaks any equipment you happen to be using. And then, which includes, by the way, spy equipment. Bugging devices would have to go haywire and stuff. But February 2014, the European Space Agency has one of these things. What happens, they've already had it. But in February 2014, the ESA's largest European acoustic facility, which is in the Netherlands, announces or somehow talks to the press and says, oh yeah, we've got these giant noise-emitting things that we use to test satellites. But if you pointed it at a person, it would kill them. And they basically said, oh, it could totally be weaponized. And then in 2015, in July, the military makes it seems to announce it every 2 years, every time they get an upgrade to its capability. But they announce once again that they are using sonic weapons, deploying sonic weapons to their fleets and to their ground forces, et cetera. And apparently they're getting smaller, more directional, and much more powerful. So as I look at this, Dr. Farrell, and I look at the history of oh, and one other thing is involved in all those operations against Cuba in the Cold War was the Cuban U.S. emigre community, all these organizations that
Yep.
were happening. And what was happening there is Kennedy at the time was trying to create kind of a detente. And
Yes.
Obama just created a detente, and
Yes.
we're on the verge of Trump saying, well, we're going to can it. Wait, we're not going to can it. We're going to can part of it, but not the business side of it. And in the middle of this, you have this explosion of attacks in Cuba that strike me as very similar to some of these operations, only using modern technology. So my question is, as I look at the timeline of the growth and testing and deployment of this technology by all kinds of people, including domestic police, getting it down almost to the consumer level, and then I look at the other timeline of operations in the past and the amplification of operations against Cuba aimed at curbing detente, ultimately resulting in the death of JFK.
Mm-hmm.
I can't just look and go, the Cuban intelligence are the ones benefiting. They're driving around in their cars with their dark sunglasses pointing sonic weapons at people. Someone else has to benefit.
Yes.
That. And do you see where I'm going? Does this,
I sort of do. Let me take a break and collect your thoughts. I've got
to formulate it as a question.
I've got a lot of thoughts on this. Let me.
Okay, good. And again, we have a look at Dr. Farrell's book collection. Now we have a look at mine. Actually, it's not here, but there's a few books behind me. There's Dr. Farrell's book collection.
Oh boy. Apologies for all the breaks. I've been up early today and drinking tankards of tea while I was working.
No worries. I've had a little scotch since we've started.
Yes.
Just a little bit. There's not that much. These glasses hold a lot.
Yeah, you've had several fingers since we got started.
So it's always better to take two fingers than one, in my view.
Jesus.
So
don't do that.
So put your kids to sleep. So the question.
Oh dear.
The question I have is twofold, A and B. So the A part is, who benefits if not the Cubans benefiting from this? And I don't think they do. And the B part is there? Am I misguided when I see a very neat template of a renewed sort of Operation Mongoose / Northwood using technology that is currently mostly being championed for development in the U.S.?
Mm-hmm.
That's my question.
No, I don't think you're. First of all, I don't think you're going out of the bounds there, because this is my suspicion as well. Somebody wants to sabotage. I disagreed with President Obama on just about everything he did, but the Cuba thing was not one of them. I thought that was a great move. It was long overdue. There's no reason to keep that island, this kind of isolated from the rest of the world. And, clearly, if you look at Raul Castro, he thinks more or less the same way. The Glorious Revolution has really kind of impoverished the country. And I don't see how the Cuban government benefits from doing anything like this at all. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, Daniel, just in the last few days, Raul Castro has come out and said, we're as mystified as everybody else, and we're going to investigate, and we'll help, do anything to prevent the embassy closure. They've got a lot to lose. They've got nothing to gain. And I think the same thing, you know, Russia has had this type of technology for a very long time. There's no doubt in my mind that basically every technologically sophisticated country in the world has it. India, Germany, France, you name it, they've got it. But let me go back and cover the sonic weapon aspect of this, because right now we're seeing debunking articles appearing in the American press. And kudos to you, doff the hat to you for reading all of those occasions of news stories where these weapons have been deployed publicly and announced that they've been deployed publicly for many, many years. So I'm extremely suspicious now that we find these debunking articles that no such weapon exists, and we're mystified as to what they are. Bull roar. Okay, that's the only way I can put it. If you go back to Giza Death Star deployed, and even in Giza Death Star, I talked about the development of sonic weapons in France under Charles de Gaulle from a French physicist by the name of Gavreau. All right, and he was employed in the French government's Black Projects world, developing infrasound weapons that could induce nausea, that could cause temporary hearing loss, you name it, these infrasound weapons could do it. There was a big Black Projects project in France during the 60s under de Gaulle, where they actually built a number of these weapons, and that was the way that France was going to stop a Warsaw Pact invasion if it ever occurred. So the weapons have been around for a very, very long time. Who benefits? Daniel, I think you're absolutely right. I've had the same thought that we're looking at Operation Mongoose dressed up with new technology from the same crowd that was trying to stop Kennedy back in the 60s and create tension, you know, Cold War tension to keep the military-industrial juggernaut going. That's exactly what I think. Russia has nothing to gain from this. Nobody has anything to gain from this other than that group of people. So that's what I think. Now, the sonic weapons themselves, and what I find suspicious here is you pointed out that these weapons were deployed after the Cole incident. And this is the thing that I think links, or perhaps may link, Cuba with the recent ramming of naval vessels, the Fitzgerald and the McCain. Because in the case of the Fitzgerald, we had one crew member reporting that he felt mystification. That was his word. So in other words, there was some sort of mental interference going on with the crews of these ships. And the other crews that we have to look at are the crews of the ramming vessels. Were they themselves perhaps victims of some sort of mind manipulation technology? And why do I connect that with Cuba? Because if you look at the patents on microwave weapons, all right, of microwave remote mind manipulation, they all have certain things in common. Number one, they rely on interferometry. In other words, you're taking two or more microwave beams, you're interfering them. In other words, you're causing them to overlap in a certain region or area, and that can be made now to be very, very precise. What that does is, if you're beaming these at the human brain, you can set up a beat frequency in the brain, all right? And that beat frequency can do any number of things depending on the frequencies you're using and the area of the brain that you're targeting with that beat frequency. You can create hearing loss. You can make people even, let me back up, you can modulate those microwaves. In other words, just like a radio wave has modulated information that the receiver will untangle and comes out as hearing a human voice on your radio set. Well, you can do the same thing with the brain because it's a receiver. So you can actually, the technologies have been patented that you can beam voices into people's head. You can make them hear things through that kind of beat frequency technology that is not actually an audible sound in the room. So in other words, what I find suspicious is you have people hearing things in bed, and they get out of bed and they go to another region of the room and they're not hearing this. To me, that's every indicator that that particular region is being interfered, and that they're setting up this kind of microwave interferometry. All right. So these technologies exist. All you have to do is go online, look up mind control technologies, and you'll find all these patents going back to the 70s of remote influencing through electromagnetic means. And one of the things they can do is make people hear things. All right. So I think all of these things definitely are related. Now, here's the curveball. Back in 2008 or 2009, Adam Parfrey, the owner of Farrell House Publishers, published a book called Secret and Suppressed, and then he followed that up with a second volume called Secret and Suppressed 2. And in the second volume, he asked me to make a contribution to the second volume, which I did. It's not very well known. It's one of the writings of mine out there that most people don't even know exists, but it's there. Because in Secret and Suppressed 1, there was an article that somebody wrote. I forget who it was. I think it may have been Ken or Keith, Ken Thomas or Keith Thomas, that wrote this article about the crash of the American airliner DC-10 at O'Hare in 1973. And they claimed in that article that the aircraft was the victim of a sonic microwave weapon that created the failure in the engine mounting that lost the engine on takeoff of that aircraft, and of course it crashed and killed everybody on board. And they pointed out that this was actually a weapon in the hands of what I've been calling the Nazi International. And I thought, gee, that's an interesting story. So I wrote my follow-up piece in the second volume about that story, pointing out that this type of weaponry did exist. The Soviets did work on it. The Germans did work on it in World War II. The Japanese even did work on it in World War II. And it had fallen into the hands of the Ain Shiro, or whatever it was called, cult in Japan, that very right-wing Japanese revanchist group in Japan, that they had acquired this technology. So I do think, that, again, we might be looking not only at the possibility of an Operation Mongoose, we might be looking at the possibility of some extraterritorial group doing this, and doing it in such a way as to pin the blame on the Cubans. The Cubans are allied with Russia and China, and getting that whole Cold War mentality stirred up again between the United States and its so-called enemies. But again, I'm talking about a third-party kind of false flag scenario thing here. But the technology absolutely exists. It has been used, as you've pointed out, with those numerous citations. It's not something that people want to talk about for the very simple reason, as I said earlier, epistemological warfare. Imagine going into court and saying, oh, Sirhan was mind controlled. What do you do in jurisprudence? How do you prove that case other than making a circumstantial one? Because this is technology that allows you to influence the events through other people and have no fingerprints whatsoever remaining to point the finger at the real culprit. That's the problem here.
So a few other additions to the timeline, and we'll put this timeline in the notes for this show. But I'm going to read an extended quote.
Again, I have to doff my hat for that timeline, because you're dead on here. That stuff is very important for people to know. But go ahead.
Well, I used a trick. So what I did was Google will let you search it by date, and you can give it a range of only give me results between these dates.
Right.
But Google News will not. And so, but if you search for something through Google, set a range of dates, and then click on the news button, suddenly it applies that date to your Google News, and now you can spot news. And what I'm using this for is, let's say that an assassination of somebody high profile, like the Malaysian consul, occurred on a certain date. What I do is search for all reference to that gentleman's name
Right.
Prior to that date.
Right.
Are there any news reports that could have indicated, what was a cause for this, what led up to this, And so searching for sonic weapons prior to the announcement of it in mid-November in Cuba is how I began to come up with news reports and to assemble the timeline. And most of them are taken from things, like the New Scientist or something other. They're all reliable, news. I stayed away from sites that are noted for speculation. But here's what one of those articles say. So, and this is a portion of an article talking about sound weapons. All of that may sound cutting edge in addition to loud, but LIPE, L-I-P-E, laser-induced plasma effect, is not the military's first attempt to harness the unique power properties of plasma matter to achieve strange effects. And this is an article on using a ball of plasma having sound. I don't understand fully how it works, but how you can make a sound weapon that deploys a ball of plasma.
Easy. I'll tell you in a moment.
Like a projectile. But in 2002, a program called the Pulsed Energy Projectile sought to create a sound effect that could literally knock rioters off their feet. The New Scientist reported a decade ago.
Right.
Supposed to be released in 2007. Instead, the project vanished. In 2004, the Navy tested plasma capabilities as a missile deflector, an initiative called Plasma Point Defense, another project with goals well beyond what the technology of the time could deliver. Such early plasma weapons were heavy. Many weighed more than 500 pounds and required enormous power to deliver very limited effects. That slowly began to change. In 2005, a company called Stellar Photonics was working on a precision sound weapon for under 2.7 for JNLWD under a $2.7 million contract that was part of a program called Plasma Acoustic Sound System, or PASS. By 2009, JNWLD was testing it with some success. A lot had changed. What we do with these prototypes, this is a quote, to date, is power them off of just a regular car battery. They don't take a lot of energy, but there is very high peak power, which is what makes this thing work, said Law. The short-term goal for PASS was a loud sound effect at a range of 100 meters, very similar to LIPE. What LIPE promises is far more volume. Current plasmas may achieve 90 to 100 decibels. We're trying to get to be around 130 or more.
Yep.
Liken the difference to a lawnmower versus a fighter jet. Every decibel is a factor of 10 times the loudness. We've been working at this in bits and pieces since 2009, but it really has just been over the past couple of years that laser technology has matured enough to be able to potentially try to get this kind of sound out of it, said Law. And so as I'm looking at this technology, $2.7 million is not a lot of money for a contract to develop a prototype. That's shockingly little money.
Yeah.
You find out that it takes shockingly little to power these things. It's really the thought. It's really the mental power that it takes to invest in engineering the weapon. It doesn't sound like that it's a fairly low tech thing to assemble the physical parts. Once you get it, you could probably 3D print the thing. So this implies several things to me, Dr. Farrell. One, if the technology exists, it could fall into hands that could possibly reproduce it very cheaply once it exists.
Yep.
There are countries that exist to do nothing but that. Instead of having R&D, they simply steal R&D. Secondly, it's very cheap to deploy it, unlike a lot of assertions that it would take far more energy than is available to create the effect. You can run it off a car battery, and they're getting smaller and less expensive, therefore, in some ways all the time. Past a certain point, smaller is more expensive. So at some point, let's assume that this technology nonetheless is a fairly high profile purchase. So my next question, and I'll put all that stuff into the timeline I put in the notes, but my next question is, let's assume that now the technology has been shrunk enough to the point it's starting to get really expensive, and these companies putting it into production instead of prototype are wanting to get paid in the tens or tens of millions or in triple digits. So this brings up the issue of high profile purchases and how they can possibly go unnoticed. And the only thought that I have is either one, they haven't gone unnoticed, which I don't know, that might mean somebody needs to evacuate Frankfurt and get rid of the records. But the Maybe they didn't go unnoticed, or maybe they're not they're unregulated weapons. Maybe these things don't technically classify as weapons, and so they would not entail the same degree of notice as selling somebody a fighter jet. Because essentially most people deny their existence, and they're basically privately funded experimental weaponry. They're used on cruise ships, for goodness sake. They're already used in the civilian sector. So that means that any private industry could probably get a hold of one. That means anyone could get a hold of one, because it ain't hard for you and I to start a cruise line on paper. So, and the other thought that I had is there's an intense naval aspect to this, because you got the Navy being some of the earliest experimenters in 2000 and 2004, and you got cruise lines picking them up in 2005, right at the same year that this Stellar Photonics starts working on the PASS system, telling me that this is for quick deployment into the civilian sector. And my question to you then, Dr. Farrell, is if sonic weapons are being used in Cuba, how can the purchases of those weapons go unnoticed, even if the deployment is small enough to go unnoticed? Is it because they're unregulated, or is it because they're not that expensive, or is it because they're not going unnoticed and there are issues around it not going unnoticed?
Okay. Oh boy. Excellent. Excellent. Let's start with plasmas and sound very briefly. If you go back to Nazi International, to what I said about Dr. Ronald Richter down there in Argentina doing his so-called fusion experiments for Juan Perón. If you read carefully what Dr. Richter said, one of the things that he said was that he was shocking his plasmas. He was putting his plasmas into rotation, and he was shocking them with gobs of direct current electricity, electrical arcs in the plasma. Now, what that does is it sets up a shock wave in the plasma, and that's any sort of shock wave like that is an acoustical phenomenon. So in other words, people may dismiss Richter, but the interesting thing is, beginning in the 1990s, you had a number of firms that started up that were going to explore the phenomenon of fusion by inducing fusion precisely through shock waves, acoustical shock waves in the plasma, rather than, big multi-billion-dollar tokamak magnets and so on and so forth. So this is a phenomenon that's very, very old and very well known. That they have weaponized this does not surprise me. That they've been using lasers to do it does not surprise me. So that, we can put that out of the realm of the impossible. It definitely isn't. It's an idea that's been around for a very long time. Now, let's look at 9/11 for a moment, because in my 9/11 book, I pointed out that there were a number of eyewitnesses on the ground close to ground zero that prior to the collapse of the Twin Towers were reporting very, very odd phenomena. They were reporting crackling sounds, which would be a sign, possibly, one possible sign would be of extremely high microwave interferometry, all right? It would produce static electrical effects in the atmosphere where this would be happening, a grinding sound. You have some people say in Cuba that have been hearing this so-called sonic weapon, which again, to me, signals microwaves, all right? So you're getting acoustical effects from this. The other thing that microwaves can do is they can create shock waves, and you have a couple of witnesses during 9/11 that record they were just suddenly picked up and thrown down the block several feet from some sort of shock wave, and this again is not connected to the pyroclastic flow of the buildings collapsing and so on. Then the third thing we need to keep in mind, and this gets directly to your question here, back in, I think it was 1997 or 1998, President Clinton's Defense Secretary, William Cohen, actually attended a conference on non-lethal weaponry. In fact, I think Janet Reno was a participant in some of these conferences as well, where they were talking about non-lethal weaponry. But in William Cohen's case, you can actually look this quotation up on the Department of Defense website. That's where I ran into it. Mr. Cohen said that these non-lethal weapons included sonic weapons, microwave weapons, and things of this sort. Infrasound, he mentioned infrasound and ultrasound, if I remember correctly. And he said that some of these weapons have fallen into the hands of terrorist groups. So in other words, he's telling you right there that there are international organizations that are extraterritorial actors that have their hands on this technology, which brings me back to what I said in response to your Operation Mongoose, updated a bit, that we might also be looking at an actor that is not any normal territorial actor trying to create tension between the West and Russia and so on, that's using this stuff. So this brings us to high power purchases. I strongly suspect that there are mechanisms in place to track purchases of these things. The problem here is that I suspect that this hidden system of finance that I've been talking about ever since covert wars and breakaway civilizations, if not before, that a part of this hidden system of finance is in turn something that developed into kind of an off-the-books arms trade that is not necessarily controlled by any one individual nation. Rather, the corporations that have been doing this research are trading in these things via this hidden system of finance. And the thing that I suspect is the key here that indicates this is if you go back to the Iran-Contra hearings in the Senate, where Senator Inouye, if you remember him, Daniel Inouye from Hawaii, was the chairman of these hearings. And the whole Iran-Contra thing, if you recall, was this very murky set of relationships between Oliver North and the National Security Council, the Department of Justice, the Nicaraguan Contras, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, a fellow by the name of Adnan Khashoggi, and this whole very complex network of sending arms to Iran in return for money that they were supplying to the Contras, and on this went. So in other words, basically what you had here was a hidden arms trade that was being conducted not officially by any government, certainly not officially by the United States, but under the auspices of elements of what we would now call the deep state. I do suspect that weapons like this, as you say, these corporations, you develop these things, you've invested a little money, and now you want to make some profits off of this. I do suspect that you would have weapons like this, which are supposedly quote-unquote non-lethal, which they can be made to be lethal, I mean, that's very clear, but which are supposedly non-lethal, that would be a part and parcel of this arms trade. What I'm most interested in is if you have a hidden system of finance with lots of money, you can also have hidden research laboratories, you can also have hidden infrastructure, you can have hidden personnel expertise involved with creating these things. That's exactly what I think is going on.
Well, it's certainly interesting technology, we have to say. I'm going to put a link to an article that I use to kind of draw some of this information out. I won't be able to provide a link to all those news stories, unfortunately, but I'll provide the timeline. My last question about this is just, can you explain what it means to have a laser-induced plasma effect, or what a ball of plasma is and how one shoots it?
Plasma is an ionized gas. In other words, if you're dealing with a plasma, areas of a plasma will be negatively charged, areas of the plasma will be positive ions. All right. So in other words, basically a plasma is a state of matter where normal atomic and molecular bonding is, so to speak, in a kind of a soup. If you can think of a thunderstorm, the clouds and the electrical discharges in the clouds, or from clouds to ground or ground to clouds. What you're dealing with, in effect, is you're dealing with kind of atmospheric forms of plasma that are at very low temperature, where these charge differentials build up and then create the conditions for the electric arc. Lasers, what lasers are doing is, number one, lasers are extremely hot. Your average, laser pointer is, if you measure the temperature of the laser, it's much hotter than you realize. They can be, your average commercial laser can be several times hotter than the surface of the sun. So what lasers are doing is they're using the heat from lasers to create the temperature gradients in a plasma that will initiate fusion. That's the thinking behind it. But there's another way that lasers can be active in plasma, and this is where weaponization of lasers comes in. Because if you have a laser, let's say you're beaming a laser through the atmosphere, like Dr. Kaku just said on CBS a couple days ago, and you're beaming several trillion watts of power in a laser beam through the atmosphere. Well, what that does is the laser actually ionizes a channel through the atmosphere that you can then fire a bolt of electricity through that channel created by the laser. So you're setting up conditions for extraordinary electrical arcing that are completely artificially driven. And that is going to create a kind of, if I can call it this, a kind of electrical acoustic shock wave. So yeah, again, plasmas and acoustics are, this is an old game. It's been around since the Germans discovered this in the 1930s. Which should give people pause, because that's what Dr. Richter said. But anyway,
there's been a lot of Nazis and Germans in this episode in the first 4 segments. We have one more segment to go, and I want to see if you can actually get Nazis out of it. I mean, okay. We've had the werewolves in segment 1. We've had the World War II bombs in segment 2.
That's the British. That's not the Nazis.
Yes, but it's still, it's near it's in Germany. It's close. And then you've got the anti-gravity in segment 3, and we've got some stuff going on in Cuba in segment 4, which you could argue there's a Nazi connection there. So maybe. So I'm going to go to segment 5, which I would like to, for our mascot, it's going to be the Andrew Jackson segment. And so this segment is segment 5, the last segment. What happens if we really find out about the Federal Reserve Gold? And so I believe this is a quote from you. You can disavow it because it comes out of some discussions back in 1994. I can't swear it's you, but I'm pretty sure it's you. So in 1994, you said, no one will ever audit the Federal Reserve because the cost of knowing is too high. And,
I said that?
I think so. But, I remember somebody going, no, it's never going to happen. They're never going to audit the Federal Reserve. And I'm like, okay. And so you weren't saying they shouldn't. You were just saying they're never going to let it happen.
Okay. And, I'll buy that.
So I asked myself, well, what the heck is new since 1994? And one thing is the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2015, which is, according to the news, is getting new life. The current administration and members of Congress are pushing it to take another shot at it and audit the Federal Reserve. And that made me ask, do we really want to do that? Because as I thought of various, Trump administrative people basking in coins of gold and throwing it over their heads and visiting the Federal Reserve and, isn't this treasure wonderful, et cetera. I wondered if they would know the difference if they were chocolate coins. And, those ones with the gold wrapper.
Or tungsten-filled gold bars, yes.
That's right. I'm not so sure. And so my question is really, what would be the effect on the U.S. and global economy of discovering that the gold in our reserve either wasn't there or was fake? And that made me shudder for a minute, because I thought, if the whole world suddenly knew tomorrow that there's no gold in the U.S. bank, or that it's all fake, which is almost worse. It means it wasn't stolen quite, it's stolen and we're ripping them off, we counterfeited. I can see an economic collapse of global and apocalyptic proportions potentially happening. And that makes me worry about all the people going, audit the reserve, audit the reserve. I'm like, ooh, I don't know about that. Even if they stole it, I don't know if we want to know that. So I wanted to give you another list. And this list is not a timeline, but I still found this list interesting. This list comes from an article by Forex on the Forex Live website called 10 Kinds of People That Post Comments to the Federal Reserve Facebook page. And there are 10 kinds of people, he asserts, that do this. And these are groups of people. Number one, audit the Fed. Will the Fed have all the records officially audited? So there's that crowd. Number two, the fiat currency disbelievers. The fiat currency is the ultimate pyramid scheme. The banksters are simply criminals who own the government. The third group is the they stole the gold group. A group of shills, he says, who determine monetary, or no, I'm sorry, he's saying that they say, a group of shills determined monetary policy for the banking cabal who took over the US Treasury in 1913 and robbed Americans of all our gold in 1934. Then there's the petrodollar group. You can't escape the death of the petrodollar, and you won't escape justice for your crimes. Enjoy your freedom for the short time you have left. Then there's the end is near group. The charlatans in DC are well aware of the consequences. They're just buying time, hoping the inevitable collapse doesn't happen on their watch. If it does, they can hide out in underground bunkers while martial law is invoked and feud, fuel, and energy are rationed out to us little people. Then there's the I want a bailout group, which says anytime scheduled to fire up the printing presses for hurricane victims, or is that only for the bankster cabal bailouts and instigating useless, endless wars? I think these are actual quotes from people that posted it to the Facebook page.
Probably.
There's something called the Martin Shkreli fan club. Martin Shkreli practiced fractional reserve banking and got fraud charges. What's with the double standard? Then there's inflation conspiracy group. Inflation is always higher than what the government uses for their figure. It's no real figure. There's two more, the they stole back the gold group. So they got their hands on the stolen gold from North Korea. So now you can tell citizens it's been there all along. We know that you're doing Pedro Gates inbreds. We're watching you. There's nothing you can do. Almost checkmate. And finally, that's got to be a quote. And finally, the Bitcoin group. Will there still be a Forum C meeting after Bitcoin becomes the currency of choice? Or an FOMC, sorry, will there still be an FOMC meeting after Bitcoin becomes the currency of choice? So what I observe about this, the number, if he's right, that there's basically 10 kinds of people posting to the Facebook group of the Federal Reserve page. In all, what they're all saying is, this sucks. You guys are cheating us. Something's fake or missing or lying or something, or the whole system is a fraud. And ultimately, it's going to come out. So the pressure's mounting, right? And so that's just a little bit of backstory for why I'm bringing this up, because you've got two things happening. You've got basically all anybody ever says to the Federal Reserve is, we're going to find out what's in there. And now you've got Congress and the president looking at it too. And so I just have really, Dr. Farrell, the one question. Really, it's an A to B. You know, would you support the thing I thought I heard you say in 1984? Do you think it'll ever really happen? And number two is, what would be the effect if we did and found out the truth and there was nothing there?
Oh, jeez. Okay, well, I'm going to smuggle Nazis into this.
I'm going to have my scotch while you do.
Well, I don't know if you are aware of something I've written about and talked about a few times. In 1928, the president of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, a good old German American, whatever he was, came to New York City to visit his good friend, Benjamin Strong, the governor of the New York Federal Reserve. And this is, incidentally, this is written about in Schacht's memoirs, Confessions of the Old Wizard. And he asked to see the gold reserve vaults in the depository. So Strong takes him down into the vaults. And they're, going around. And then Schacht asks to see the Reichsbank's gold. Off the staff goes. They come back a few minutes later, Schacht says, and they embarrassingly report that they cannot find the Reichsbank's gold. And Schacht very calmly records this in his memoirs, and he says that he turned to Governor Strong and he says, "That's okay, I know you're good for it." And that's all he says. Now, stop and picture this. The head of a central bank, major European central bank, one of the brains in the brain trust behind the Bank of International Settlements, asks to see his country's gold reserves and is informed that they cannot be found by the very depository that's responsible for keeping the gold reserves for Germany in this country. Now, there was always speculation that the reason that Schacht got off with such a light sentence at Nuremberg was because he had something on them. And I suspect that this is related to it. But in answer to your question, would we really want to know what's the big secret that, and I do agree with those people that think that there's something fishy, something that smells about the Federal Reserve, and for that matter, the American gold reserves. I suspect that what the big secret is it is related to the massive amounts of gold that President Truman secretly authorized this country to recover from the Japanese Operation Golden Lily during World War II, when Field Marshal Yamashita in 1944 was told to take it, rather than risk shipping all of that loot to Japan at that late stage in the war with the American submarine warfare against Japanese shipping, they took the decision to bury that loot in the Philippine archipelago, which he did. Truman heard about this through, incidentally, General Ed Lansdale, at that time Captain Ed Lansdale, that for all of you JFK assassination researchers. Truman was briefed on this on orders from General MacArthur to Lansdale. And Truman took the decision in 1947 to keep all of this a state secret, but to proceed with the secret recovery of this cache of gold. And his reasons for doing so were to create a hidden slush fund for covert operations, and I think also for black projects, that was totally off the books. In other words, we're talking about my hidden system of finance. We're not talking about the black budget. And what he did is he puts the American intelligence community in the banking business. Now, to make a system like this work, you have to have the participation, and I pointed this out in San Mateo, you have to have the participation of the major prime banks of the West, think Deutsche Bank, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and so on and so forth, to make a system like this work. And number two, what this allows you to do is it allows you to take any of that gold, keep it entirely off the books, and you can use it to manipulate all sorts of markets. You can use it as a secret reserve. You can rehypothecate that, therefore, because it's secret after all, not many people know about it. So what you can do is you can rehypothecate that non-existent gold over and over again, and eventually what's going to happen, I think, is that gold becomes mixed with the public system of finance, and that gets rehypothecated. So in other words, what I think the secret is that the Federal Reserve may have, and the U.S. bullion depositories may be up to their earlobes in gold. The problem is that gold has been rehypothecated so much that the liquidity in the system far exceeds the amount of gold backing it. That's the problem, and that's the secret. Now, what would happen if that were ever known? Well, number one, it would disclose the fact, something that Catherine Fitz has been saying for years. It would disclose the fact that the reason that financial analysis is not capable of coming up with workable models is because there's 50% of the financial system that's completely off the books that no one is looking at. So in other words, she calls it the biggest material omission you can think of. This is why financial analysis is so off the mark in recent years. There's something going on that's entirely off the books that they're not aware of, and that's skewing the analysis, and none of it's making sense. The other thing that would happen is, because you're rehypothecating and creating an immense volume of liquidity for your black projects, for covert operations, because of that, that means that that liquidity is not appearing anywhere in the form of inflation. Okay? So in other words, you've got an awful lot of cash sloshing around in the system somewhere. In other words, there's a hidden system of finance. If you were to disclose that, what you would then be disclosing is that most of the Western financial system, since the end of World War II, as a mechanism, had to be established to sustain the Cold War and sustain these long-term black projects. So in other words, what I'm suggesting to you is that the Western financial system has at its core a system of industrial scale fraud. And if it were disclosed, if all those dots were ever connected, that system would come crashing down. Now, I think, in fact, that Russia and China, because of their huge buying of gold, I think they are aware of this system, and that's the reason they're doing it. And they are not willing to challenge the system overtly because they don't want to crash, because that crash will affect them. They are trying to transition away from that system in as smooth a fashion as they can by creating their own international independent financial clearing mechanisms, independent of SWIFT and CHIPS in the West. And it's because they know of the existence of that system. If they're successful in transitioning that system, the entire financial basis behind the American military-industrial complex collapses. So the long term is they're trying to get rid of the American empire. That's the reason I don't think the Fed will ever be audited, because at the heart of it is a national security issue that dates back several decades, all the way back to the Truman administration. It's because of national security that it won't happen.
Well, Dr. Farrell, it has been a rip-roaring show. I have a couple of passing mentions, and then I think we're kind of at the end. So I just can't not get by without mentioning the flying lozenge that we narrowly averted, the pockmarked intruder we call Florence, and you know, the asteroid that looks like a space.
Oh yes, yes, yeah, okay.
I found that amazing. If you look at it the right way, it really does look a little bit like a bus. You know,
it does.
Like a school bus, but fortunately, I think that would be going way too far out on the limb. You know, if you look closely, it's not a bus, but it's hurricane season. You know, the winds outside are pretty strong. We got a flood warning on our shores. It's only Category 1 here in New York City because of Hurricane Jose, but I can't help but notice it's a time of signs importance. We got wildfires and earthquakes in LA, and we got hurricanes, and we got asteroids flying by. It's an interesting moment to be here contemplating things like this.
Well, if you want to contemplate things like this in the Federal Reserve, think of Philippe Lebel. My problem with those people wanting to audit the Federal Reserve, and I think there's only one other person that got it, and that was Congressman Paul years ago. He pointed out that if you wanted to really audit the Federal Reserve, you'd have to do it like Philip Lebel did to the Templars. You'd have to go in at the same coordinated moment to every branch of the Federal Reserve, unannounced, with absolutely secret as possible preparations to go in and seize the records before they could be tampered with, modified, or destroyed. The problem is, remember what happened to Philippe Lebel. He did that with the Templars, and ostensibly, the academic explanation is he was in need of money, had been refused some loans from the Templars, so he decided to shut them down, seize their treasure. But what happened was there wasn't any treasure in the Templar temples. The Templar fleet had sailed from La Rochelle, and here's Philip le Bel ending up with nothing other than a major crisis on his hands. That's what I think the Federal Reserve is, and that's what you'd have to do, and it probably wouldn't be as successful.
Just in time to fund the rebellion of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce.
Yes, just in time, exactly. Ain't that a coinky dink? But
like a worm. All right. Well, this is great, Dr. Farrell. I will get this.
Thank you again.
Member section. Thank you.